Every man in Calder gets one calling. One ring of chalk, one word, one spirit, and whatever climbs out of that ring belongs to you until the day you die. Mine came out the size of my thumb, sat down on the chalk line, and yawned. I was 19. I grew up in the river house at Bellwater with no father worth naming and no mother worth the question, and by the time I reached the 9th I had owned 3 things in my whole life. A spoon. A knife with a split handle. Half a blanket I shared with a boy who died of fever in his sleep. The calling was supposed to be the 4th thing. It was supposed to be the one that counted. Ilo Grange chalked the rings for the chalk house that autumn. Same year as me, same month, same yard behind Sallow Mill. He had pulled a black boar at 17 and he had been unbearable about it ever since. He offered to pass me over the night before. 30 rings to chalk before dark, and a man who gives up his turn sleeps indoors and gets a mug of something warm. He put it to me the way you offer a favor to a friend. Where does a turn go when a man gives it up? Back to the crown. And when do I get another one? He looked at me the way you look at somebody who wants to know when the river will start running uphill. So I stood in my ring in the wet grass at first light with my boots soaking through, and I spoke the word, and the chalk went hot under my feet. Something came up out of the ground like a seed going backwards. Green light, a smell of crushed stems, and then a small hard weight landing on the chalk. She was the length of my thumb, brown at the shoulders, green down the back, wings like a moth that had been through a hedge. 2 black eyes with no white in them. She looked at the sky, decided against it, and sat down. Grange came around the ring, looked at what was sitting on my chalk, and gave the yard exactly what it wanted. Level 1, he said. Fairy. No result. He moved on to the next ring and the 9th started laughing behind me, and I stood there with my heart going like a hammer and my ears burning, because I had waited 2 years for that ring and the whole business had taken less time than a piss. Bram O'Dell did not laugh. Bram had 11 years in the company and a son in it, and that morning he had explained to me why we were getting our calling so early in the season. A company that is going to be spent gets its rights paid out first. The crown does not like waste. We were marching to Marrow Ford that afternoon. Nobody holds Marrow Ford. Everybody on the Ashen knows it, the way everybody knows which ice will take a man's weight. The fairy went to sleep on the chalk. I picked her up in both hands, and she was warm, and she weighed about as much as a wet leaf, and she did not wake. Behind me Grange's boar turned its head. That animal had never turned its head for a living man in 6 years. It looked at the thing in my hands the way a dog looks at a door. Grange missed it. I did not, and I put it away in the place where I keep things I do not understand yet, and I have gone back to that place more times than I like. Dova Marsh watched the whole thing from the mill steps. Dova had followed the 9th since the Harrow burned her village and her husband with it, and she had a mouth on her that made old men study their boots. She looked into my hands. What are you going to do with that, then? Feed it. Feed it where? It will fit anywhere, that. Anywhere at all. Then she gave the yard the exact spot, and both of the Rill boys had to sit down. Marin Lask had the 9th, and Lask was the one who put me where I ended up. She came down the yard looking at faces, and she stopped at me for about as long as it takes to blink. Far bank, she said. Take the new ones. The far bank at Marrow Ford is where you put the ones you can afford to lose, and the new ones were 11 boys with 2 months of drill between the lot of them. Nobody argued. Nobody argues with arithmetic. That is how it starts, and I want to be honest about it, because afterwards people put it differently. I did not walk out of that yard with a plan. I walked out with a sleeping insect in my fist and my ears still hot. The Ashen runs green and slow above the ford, then goes over a gravel shelf and turns loud. Sallow Mill sits upstream on the Calder side with its wheel dead and its sluice rusted open a hand's width. Marrow Ford is 200 paces of shin-deep water, and in a dry autumn a horse crosses it at a trot without wetting its belly. That autumn had been dry since the middle of summer. We got there before dark and dug what you can dig in gravel, which is a hole that fills with water. Bram's son Pell worked next to me. Pell had his father's hands and none of his patience, and he warned me twice that the ferry was going to get sat on. Tam and Oren Rill dug together at the end of the line, one shovel between them, changing over without a word about it. Twins do that. They had been one person in 2 bodies since Brindle, and the company used a single name for the pair when they were out of earshot. Asa Keel came over to the far bank at dusk with her bow and her nephew. Asa was the best shot on that whole stretch of river and had been since before I could shave. Her sister Ilsa died when Wick was 4, and Asa had been raising him in a company of grown men ever since, which covers most of what you need to know about her. Wick was 14 and he ran messages and he was proud of it. He was also, that night, so cold he had gone past shivering into the shaking that comes after. He sat with his back to the gravel bank and his hands going like moths in a jar, and Asa crouched in front of him and held out a cup, and he could not take it. He got both hands round it and the water came over the rim and down his wrists. Take the cup. I am taking it. Am I not taking it? You are watering the beach. Then I let out the thing that started all of it, in the tone you use for filling a gap. Half a joke, half nothing. Asa, give the boy your hands, he is spilling my water. Asa laughed and opened her fingers to let the cup go before it fell. Something came off my shoulder like a spark off a fire. There was that smell again, crushed green stems, and a line of light about as thick as a thread went from Asa's open hand into Wick's wrists. It lasted the time it takes to speak a name. Then Wick was holding the cup dead level in both hands with the water flat as a table, and Asa was sitting back on her heels staring at her own fingers, and her fingers were shaking so hard she could not have held a rope. Not one of them on that bank made a sound. Wick lifted the cup and drank and looked at his hands over the rim like they belonged to somebody else. Asa came out with something I will keep out of this account, because Wick was 14. Then she got her voice down flat. Put it back. How? I said. I do not care how. Put it back. I had no idea. That is what I remember most clearly out of the whole night, standing there with my mouth open and a bankful of boys watching me, and having no idea at all. The fairy landed on Asa's knuckle and sat there. Asa looked at her the way you look at a wasp on your bread. Then she reached across with her shaking hand and touched her with one finger, and the thread went out like a lamp. Asa flexed her hands. Steady as stone. Wick dropped the cup. Bram came down the bank then, because Bram always came down the bank when it went quiet, and he stood over the wet patch in the gravel and looked at the 11 of us. What did you do? I went through it. He made me repeat it twice. Then he sat down on an ammunition box with his knees cracking and gave me the first sensible order anybody gave me that autumn. Do it again. On me. Same words, same order. A thing that works once and cannot be done twice is worse than a thing that never worked at all. That was Bram. 11 years in the ninth, his son 30 paces away, and the first thought in his head was a test. We spent the middle of that night finding out what she would do, and I have never learned so much so fast about anything in my life, including how to stay alive. She takes one thing at a time. One thread. While a thread is up she will not lift another, and she sits on your shoulder and ignores you like a cat. She takes from a hand that opens. Bram held his fist shut and ordered her to take his strong back and put it in Pell, and nothing whatever happened. He opened his fist, same words, and Pell staggered. She does not take what is not in you. Oren Rill opened both hands and offered his courage, big grin, whole bank watching, and she flew over and sat on his thumb and stayed there. Well. She is thinking about it. She is waiting for you to have some, his brother put in. Thinking is a different animal. Oren's ears went red. Tam laughed until he choked. And two of the new boys quietly closed their hands and stepped back out of the light, and I learned more about my own company in that minute than in 2 years of marching with it. She does not take what lies in your head. Hescott of Brindle offered everything he knew about horseshoes, and she would not touch it. Wick offered his letters, because he could read and most of them could not, and she would not touch that either. Hands. Lungs. Nerve. Night eyes. Wind. The thing in your gut that decides whether you run. Whatever is in the meat and the wires of a man, she will lift it out whole and set it down in somebody else as though it grew there. And she gives it back when the sun goes down. That was the first hard edge, and we found it by accident, because dawn was coming and Pell got his back returned to him halfway through a shovel stroke and sat down in the water. The other edge we did not find that night. We came up against it and I decided not to look. Asa gave twice. The first time the thread went up before the last word was out of my mouth. The second time the fairy came down onto her wrist and sat there for 3 long breaths with the whole bank watching, and then took it. She went slow that time, Wick said. She is tired. Are you sure that is what tired looks like? I let it go, which should have warned me, because that boy had never in his life let a thing go by without answering it. The trading started before it got light, and I want it on the record that I did not start it. Soldiers will bargain over anything. Give them a way to hand pieces of themselves around and they will have a market running before breakfast. What is my stomach worth? Which stomach? The one that ate 9 of Dova's dumplings at Brindle Harvest and won 4 shillings doing it. Hesk wanted a dry coat for that stomach. Oren offered his ears for the rest of somebody's bacon and learned that his hearing was already spent. Pell announced what he would give up permanently, and for how long a week in a town with a name, and what he offered was nowhere near his hands or his lungs. Would anybody miss it? Dova wanted to know. Not the way he uses it, Asa put in. Then Dova took the boy apart at some length in front of everybody, working downward, and Pell went the color of a boiled crab and the far bank of Marrow Ford laughed so hard that a heron went up off the shallows and Bram had to hiss at us to shut our mouths in case the river carried. I remember thinking that men who are about to be spent do not usually sound like that. Tam Rill did no bidding. Tam sat with his boots in the gravel and watched the black water going over the shelf, and after a while his brother stopped laughing and went and sat next to him without saying anything. I looked at the whole lot of them, 11 boys on a bank they were not going to leave, and I let out the thing I have gone over a great many times since. If she could hold more than one thread, I could put this entire company on its feet at the same moment. Bram shut me up. He did it kindly. Dawn was 2 hours off, wishes weigh nothing, and there were riders on the wet road. Wick had brought that in at midnight and I had not been listening properly. Riders coming down from the Coldgate side. Yorn's people. Yorn ran the Harrow patrols on our stretch, and Yorn was a careful man who did not lose things. He had 60 horse, a dry ford, and orders to be across it by breakfast. We had 11 boys on the far bank, Asa, Bram, and a thing the Corps had written off in front of the whole yard. We were not going to hold 200 paces of shin-deep water against horse. You do not hold a ford, you hold a river, and there was no river at Marrow that autumn, only a wet path with a bank on each side. So it came down to Sallow Mill, and I will go slowly here, because it is the first time I did the arithmetic I have been doing ever since. The sluice had rusted open a hand's width, and behind it sat a head of water that the miller's family had been arguing over for 2 generations. Open the gate and the shelf below floods to a horse's chest for most of a morning. The gate beam is under the wheel, in the dark, in the water, and somebody has to hold it down while the pin comes out, and the pin is seized. Call it the time it takes to walk 50 paces. Bram could not do it. Bram had lungs like wet sacks after 11 winters. Pell could not hold his breath long enough and knew it. Hesk sank like an anvil, being shaped like one. Tam Rill could hold his breath longer than any man in the company. He had won money on it twice. Tam Rill also would not go into black water. When the twins were 9 they went through the ice at Brindle Mill Pond, and Oren came out first, and Tam came out after, and something in him stayed down there. He put it to us himself, sitting on the gravel, and he did not dress it up. I will go in, and I will get to the wheel, and then I will come straight back up. I came up at the pond and I came up at Coldgate and I will come up here. Then the ford is open and we all die. Is that plain enough? Oren offered to go instead. Tam wanted to know how long his brother could hold his breath, and Oren knew the number, and the two of them had a whole argument out of one look, and then Oren sat down. That was when Asakeel spoke my name. She was already watching me when I turned round, and she had worked it out before I had, which does not surprise me now. The boy needs a nerve that does not care about the dark, she said. Whose have you got? Yours. Yes. Bram stood up. She is the only shot we have. 60 horse coming down a wet path in the open, and you want to take her hands off her an hour before it starts? Not her hands. Her nerve. Can you swear to me there is a difference? I could not swear to it. I had known about any of this for 6 hours, and I owned up to it, and it was the right answer even though it cost me the room. Then Lass came across the ford with the water round her boots and stood in the middle of us and put the only question that mattered. What does it cost, she said, and who pays? I made myself put it plainly. Asa loses her nerve until the sun goes down. She will still see and she will still draw, and when it matters her hands will do what Wick's hands were doing last night. Tam gets it. Tam goes under the wheel and comes back up, and we have a river instead of a path. And if we leave it alone? Then Tam goes down and comes back up empty, and I do not blame him for it, and 60 horse cross at first light onto 11 boys. Nobody enjoyed that piece of arithmetic. Bram looked at the gravel. Wick looked at his aunt. Asa settled it herself, in front of everybody, and I have never forgotten how she did it. 60 horse against my bow is 9 of them down and then me dead. 60 horse against chest-high water is yourn going home to think it over. My sister's boy is standing on this bank. What exactly are we discussing? Then she put her hand out flat with the palm up and waited, and her hand was steady, and it stayed steady the whole time I was speaking. Asa Keel. Your nerve. To Tam Rill. She had seen him every day for a year and a half, which matters, though I did not yet know how much. The thread came up green and went across, and Tam's whole body changed shape. His shoulders came down. His head turned to the water and stayed there. "Ha," he said. Then he pulled his boots off and walked into the ashen at the top of the shelf without one word to his brother, and Oren made a noise I have not heard a grown man make before or since. Asa sat down on the gravel very carefully, the way you put down something breakable, and pushed both hands under her arms. The rest of it went the way I had promised Lask it would go, which is the only time in my life that has ever happened. Tam got to the wheel. Tam held the beam down in the black with his boots braced on the sill and worked that pin free while the dead axle ground away over his head. And he came up twice for air and went back down twice, and the second time he was under so long that Oren went into the water to his waist. Then the beam came up and the gate went with it, and 2 generations of that family's argument came out of Sallow Mill in one long grey shove. I have seen a great deal of water since. I have never seen anything like the sound it made going over that gravel shelf, or like Yorn's forward riders coming round the elbow of the wet road into a ford that had been shin-deep at midnight and was now at their horses' chests and rising. They came on anyway, because Yorn was careful and not slow, and because a man in the water at a walk is still a man coming at you. The next hour I remember in pieces. Bram's line on the bank. Hesk swinging a shovel like an anvil with a grudge. Wick running the length of the gravel 4 times with his mouth open and no message to carry. Colmte went down in the shallows with a lance through him and did not come up, and a boy called Rees drowned in 4 feet of water with nobody near him, which is how most of it actually happens. Pelodell went in to pull a rider off a horse and stayed there too long, the way his father never would have. And there was one rider up on the gravel where the flood had not reached, coming down behind our line with a long axe. 40 paces. Asa Keel makes that shot in her sleep. I have watched her make it in the rain. She got the bow up and she got the string back and she held it, and I saw her elbow go, that small sick tremble I had watched pour into Wick's wrists on that same gravel 8 hours before. She loosed and it went a hand's width wide and buried itself in the mud past his shoulder. Bram put the man down himself, 2 steps late. 2 steps late was Pell's arm from the elbow down. We held Marrow Ford. Yorn pulled his people back onto the wet road before the sun was properly up, sat his horse on the rise a while looking at the water, and went home to think it over, exactly as Asa had promised. There is a thing I had no way of knowing until much later, so I will put it where it belongs. Yorn sat on that rise long enough for his own people to start muttering, and what held him there was not the flood. He was looking at a boy on the far bank with something on his shoulder, and at a woman sitting on the gravel with her hands under her arms and a bow at her feet. Yorn had crossed 4 rivers that autumn against people who wanted to stop him. He knew what a company looks like when it is doing everything it can. That bank was doing something else, and he could not put a name to it, and men like Yorn hate that more than they hate losing a ford. He wrote to Corvain that night. 6 lines. I have never seen them and I do not need to. On our side of it the price came in before the water went down. They took Pell's arm off below the elbow on the mill steps, because that was the flattest dry thing we had. Hesk held him. Dova did the hot iron and swore at him without a pause from start to finish, which was the kindest thing anybody did that morning, because it gave him something to be angry at. I stood where I could be seen. I had worked out on the walk up from the bank that hiding would be worse. Bram came out of the mill with his son's blood on him and the whole company watching, and I want to be exact here, because it is the most important thing that happened at Marrow Ford and it had nothing to do with the water. He did not forgive me. He has never once used that word to me. He walked to the middle of the yard and put it to them, in the flat voice he kept for boot inspections. The far bank had held because I had put Asa's nerve into Tam Rill. He had argued against it and he had been wrong. From this morning the 9th would open its hands when I named a name, or come and explain to him why not. Then Oren put the question that was in every head, because Oren never could keep his mouth shut. Your boy lost his arm for it. My boy is alive, he said. 11 of them are alive. I have buried better arithmetic than that. Cold, that reply. Cold as the river. He went back into the mill and sat with Pell and did not come out until dark, and he has never let on what it cost him, and I have never once gone at him about it. Neve Sallow came down from the mill at noon with her skirts wet to the knee and stood in front of Lask and wanted to know who was going to pay for the Rylands. The Rylands is the water meadow below the mill, and her winter hay was stacked on the low stave at the end of it, and by noon the water was a foot up the stack and still climbing. Her husband had been dead 4 years. She had 2 cows, a mother-in-law with a bad hip, and that hay, and we had run a river through the middle of it to save 11 boys she had never laid eyes on. Lask had nothing for her. Lask had 2 dead, 1 arm, and a report to write. Dova got in front of them both before it turned into something. Dova had lost a village to the other side of this war, and she knew exactly how that conversation goes when soldiers save you and then hand you the bill. How many hands to shift that stack above the line before dark? 6. And I have got me. You have got you and a woman with a bad hip. Half this lot would give you their backs for a loaf and the other half for a look at you, and neither half is any use to you wet. Then name your price and be quick, because I am losing it while we stand here. I went up to the stave with her and I gave her the truth first, because Bram was watching and because I could not invent a lie fast enough. I can put a back on you that will do the work of 3 until the sun goes down. It comes out of a living man who wants it himself, and he has it again at dusk, and I do not yet know what it costs him the 2nd time or the 10th. Neve looked at me for a while. Whose back? Mine is no good to you. Hesk out of Brindle. He is the one shaped like an anvil. Then go and ask him, and stop talking at me. Hesk opened his hand on the stave with chaff all over him, and I named it, and Neve Sallow went up that stack like something out of a story and had her winter above the waterline by 4 in the afternoon. She fed us 2 loaves, an onion each, no thanks from anybody on either side. It is the first threat I ever put into a person who was not going to fight. I have thought since that the war turned on that afternoon more than it turned on the sluice. At the time I was mostly pleased about the onion. Asa got her nerve back at sunset. She was on the mill steps when it arrived, and she felt it come, and she picked up a cup and held it out at the end of her arm and watched it not move. Then she made a small sound, put the cup down, and went and stood in the dark by herself for a while. I sat with the fairy on my knee and looked at her properly for the first time since the yard. She was bigger, a little in the body, more in the wings, which had gone from moth to something with a spine in them, and when she walked across my palm she left a mark in the sweat. A wet leaf in the morning. A small bird by dark. Wick worked it out ahead of me. He came and sat down with the arithmetic already done. 9 threads between dusk and dawn, and a thing that gets heavier by carrying is like nothing he had ever heard of. Did you see her go slow with Asa the 2nd time? I saw it. So what happens to whatever she is slow about? I had nothing for him that night. I have one now, and it cost the best shot on the ash and everything she had. Then he went and dug Ilsa's brass thimble out of his pack, the one thing he had carried from home, and set it on the boards and put a rag in the bottom of it. She climbed in, turned round twice, and slept there every night after. She got her name that evening, and Dova gave it to her, and it stuck the way the true ones do. Grange's black boar had come down to the mill with the core horses and spent the whole afternoon at the bottom of the steps looking up at a thimble. Nobody could shift it. Dova threw a boot at it and the boot came back. Anything that pulls a boar and stings that hard is a nettle, she said. I tried for 2 threads that night, because I had to know. Bram gave his back to Hesk, and in the same breath I named Wick's night eyes to Oren, and nettle bit me hard enough to draw blood and went back into the thimble. 1 thread. 1 at a time. Whatever else was going to change, that had not changed yet. Lask wrote her report on the mill table with a stub of pencil and no expression on her face at all. A company sent to Marrow Ford to slow somebody down had held it, against Yorn, for 2 dead and 1 arm. She went over her last line twice and then looked up at me across the table. I have to explain how. Then explain it. I am going to. That is what worries me. I did not understand her that night. I understood her 9 days later, when a man came down the wet road from the Corps with my name in his mouth and a right of the crown to talk about, and a black boar walking at his heel. He came on the 9th day, and he came at noon so that the whole company would be out in the open to see it. Ilo Grange rode down the wet road on a Corps horse with the black boar trotting at the stirrup, and he had a wax seal thing in his coat, and he had that face on him that men get when they have decided in advance to be reasonable. We had been rivals the way 2 boys are rivals when only one of them is being watched. He had 6 years of being watched. I had a spoon and a knife. He got down in the mill yard and looked at the mended fence and the new gravel in the place where they had taken Pell's arm off, and he waited for Lask, because he had the sense to bring the argument to her instead of to me. The crown's position went like this: what comes out of your ring is yours for life, and no man may take it from you. A spirit that works on other soldiers is an instrument of the Corps, and instruments go where the Corps sends them. Both of those are true at once, and that is why I am here and not somebody with a rope. Where does she go? Cold Gate. Under the Corps. Used on named men, by written order, where the line actually decides things. Named men, Bram said from the fence. You mean the ones with names? Grange did not rise to it. He wanted a demonstration instead, and that is where the day turned, though nobody in that yard understood it until it had already happened. Hesk stood out and opened his hand, and he meant it, because Hesk has never in his life managed to mean anything by halves. Grange spoke the words. My words, my order, the giver, the thing, the taker, one breath. Nothing happened at all. He spoke them again. Nettle sat on the rail with her wings folded and looked at him the way she looks at rain. Then Lask put it to me, and I spoke the same words in the same order, and Hesk's back went into Oren Rill and Oren went 2 steps sideways under the weight of it. Grange stood in the middle of the yard for a while. Whose is she? Mine. Since when? Say it properly. She came out of my ring and she works when I speak and she sleeps in a boy's thimble. She is mine and she does not travel. That should have been the end of it. It was the middle of it, because Grange was not stupid, and he had already worked out the thing that took me another 3 heartbeats. Then the Corps does not need the ferry, he said. The Corps needs you. The seal came out of his coat. Both of us to Coldgate, the thing and the tongue, and the 9th back to being a company that gets sent to Fords. Wick made a noise. Dova started on Grange with the whole of her vocabulary, which took some time and included a suggestion about the boar that I will not repeat, and Bram put a hand on her shoulder and she stopped, and that is the only time I ever saw her stop. And then Grange did the thing I did not forgive him for until much later, which is that he was honest. Who decides? He was not shouting. That is the question, and none of you have put it once in 9 days. Who in this army gets to be strong today, and who goes without? Him. That one. 19 years old, out of the river house at Bellwater, an orphan with no land and no name and nobody over him. He let that sit. He was wrong once already. It cost Bram O'Dell's boy an arm at the elbow. He will be wrong again, because everybody is, and when he is, there is nothing above him. That is what the Corps is for. I had nothing for him. I want that written down, because from here on I am going to be the one who was right about most things, and on that afternoon, in that yard, in front of Bram, the man I hated had the better of the argument and I stood there with my mouth shut. Bram spoke instead. Bram put it that his boy was his boy, and that he would take the arm over the 11, and that he had already stood in the middle of that yard once and stood by it. Grange looked at the two of us for a long moment and something went out of his face. I have had that animal 6 years, he said. It has never once changed what happened. Not at Coldgate, not on the wet road, not anywhere. It eats, and it frightens horses, and it stands behind me at inspections so that people look at me. Your thing turned a river around in one night. He got back on his horse. Then he handed the seal to Lask instead of to me, which was his way of leaving a door open, and Lask read it and did what Lask does, which is trade. She kept us. The price was 2 things. The first was that the 9th came off Marrow and onto the wet road, because Corvain's grain wagons were already rolling north and Brindle sits where the road bends. The second was Van Rusk. Rusk came down 2 days later on a mule with his kit tied on wrong. Corsleeve, a face like a boy who has been informed he is being trusted and knows better. He pulled a level 2 at his own calling, a mostode that changes color when it is frightened, and after that the Corps put him where they put everybody who pulls a 2. His orders were short. No thread goes up without Van Rusk saying yes first. He said no for 6 days. He refused Hesk lifting a wheel out of the ditch. He refused Oring giving his wind to a runner. He said no to a thread that would have got a cart of turnips over the ford before dark, and we ate the turnips wet. The company started phrasing things at him. Pell, who had one arm and a new mouth to go with it, would come up and want to know whether it would be permitted to give a man half a headache, and whether a headache was a thing of the body or a thing of the mind, and Rusk would go through it seriously every time, which made it funnier. Dova wanted to know whether she could give her mother-in-law's temper to a mule, and if not, why not, and whether he would like her to write it down and post it to Coldgate along with a drawing. Rusk wrote nothing down. He kept it in his head, and every night he sat by himself outside the light with his moss toad on his knee, and the toad went pale gray, which is what it does when the thing holding it is afraid. On the 7th day I stopped fighting him and put him a question instead. What are you afraid of? That you are right. That was the whole of it. If the ring measures the man, then Van Rusk is a moss toad and always will be, and there is a kind of peace in that. If the ring measures nothing, then he has spent 4 years being nothing for no reason at all. Nothing kind came to me, so I gave him the true thing. She would take from you. You have got something in you she would carry. He looked at me like I had hit him, and then he got up and went to bed, and the toad went from grey to a color I had not seen on it before. Brindle sits 7 miles up the wet road where the road bends around a hill, and it has a forge, a pond, a stone barn, and about 300 people who have never in living memory been anything to anybody. Hesk grew up in that forge. His master was Tor Yale, who had taught him for 9 years, and who had the only fixed opinion in Brindle that anybody bothered to argue with. We got there in the afternoon and the wagons were already in the square. That was Corvain's way, and this was the first time I saw it working, and I want to describe it honestly because for a long time afterwards I thought about it more than I thought about anything else. He did not burn Brindle. He did not put a man on the road with a torch. He put 20 wagons of rye in the square in daylight, and he sent one grey-haired quartermaster called Gant, with no weapon and a bad hip, to stand next to them and take the questions. The questions were the whole of the trick. How much? All of it. In exchange for what? Brindle stops being Calder. Nobody leaves. Nobody is taken. Nobody has to fight. The forge keeps working and the pond keeps its fish and the winter gets survived. And what about the boys of Brindle who are already in the 9th? They can come home, the quartermaster said. Any time they like. We will not touch them. Half the square looked at Hesk. I stood there with a thumb-sized thing on my shoulder and the whole of my method needing one person in that village to open one hand, and I could not find one, and I want to be exact about why, because it was not cowardice. They had heard about the Rylands. Somebody always carries the flooded hay up the road and leaves the 60 horse behind. They had heard about Pelodell's arm, and about what the arm had bought, and the arithmetic that sounded fine on a gravel bank sounded different in a square with children in it. And they had Tor Yale, who put it to me directly, in front of everybody, with his apprentice standing on my side of the square. You want somebody's hands. Name what it costs. I gave him the truth, because Dova was watching and because I had started at the Rylands and could not stop now. Until sunset. It comes back at sunset. It comes back a little smaller each time, and I do not yet know where the bottom of that is, and the woman who is given the most is the best shot on this river and she is not as good as she was. Tor Yale nodded slowly. Then he pointed at the wagons. That man is offering rye. You are offering to make me worse at my own trade for a day, so that somebody I have never met can be better at his. Nobody in that square opened a hand. Not one. Rusk stood next to me with his ears burning, and he had come 7 miles ready to refuse me, and now there was nothing to refuse, and I think that hurt him more than the 6 days of saying no. Dova saved what could be saved, and she did it by ignoring the elders entirely and going to work on the women at the pond, and by evening she had what she wanted, which was information. Brindle had already decided. 2 nights before we got there, the wagons were the ceremony. Then she came and stood in front of me in the dark and put her hand out flat, palm up, with the fingers spread wide. I have got one thing, she said. Take it. Which thing? I have not slept since my husband burned. Not one night. 14 months. You want a man who can watch all night without his eyes going? There he is. That is me. Take it and give it to somebody who has to stand on a wall. I had never once thought of it as a thing that could be given, and neither had she until that afternoon, and neither of us knew what would happen when a woman hands over the reason she is awake. Dova Marsh. Your sleeplessness. To Oren Rill. The thread went up green and short, and Oren's eyes went wide and stayed wide, and he stood the whole night on the Brindle Road and saw a fox at 400 paces and complained about it until dawn. And Dova Marsh lay down in the cart under a wet blanket and slept 14 hours. She cried when she woke up. She swore at me while she was doing it. Then she wanted to know when she could do it again, and I let it lie, because I had watched Nettle sit 3 breaths on Oss's wrist and I had a bad feeling about anything that felt free. We left Brindle in the morning and Toriel came out to the road to see his apprentice go. "Come home." "Not while there is a wagon in the square," Hesk said. And then, after a while, when we were a mile down the road and he thought nobody was listening, he gave me the other half of it, which was that his master had made the decision for him in front of the entire village without once turning round. The 9th marched away 6 strong, less than it had been the year before, out of a village that was no longer Calder, and behind us the forge started up again for a country we had been fighting since the spring. That was the day the war stopped being about rivers for me. Corvain was not taking ground. He was taking the people who would have opened their hands, and he was paying for them in a currency I did not have. Jorn had watched the whole afternoon from the hill above Brindle with 4 riders and no intention of coming down, and I learned what follows only much later. He sent a Brindle boy to Corvain. Not a spy. A boy of 16 who had been in the square and had heard every word that passed between Toriel and me, and who was paid a silver piece and a coat for repeating it. The boy repeated it well. He got the sunset right, and the smaller each time, and the woman who was not as good as she was. Corvain heard him out twice. I only met the man 3 times in my life and I have spent a great deal of the rest of it trying to describe him. He was 50. He had a farmer's hands and a bookkeeper's patience and he had not lost a soldier in 4 months, and he reminded everybody of it, constantly, because it was the whole of his reputation and he had earned it. His country had lost its harvest in 1 week in the spring, to blight and then to rain, and he had stood up in front of his own people and promised that not one of them would die for bread. He had kept that promise for a year by buying everything that could be bought. He put the boy one question, and it is the best question anybody has put about me in the whole war. "What does the boy's thing run on?" The Brindle boy did not understand it. Jorn did. "It runs on people being willing." Jorn had that much, and Corvain sat with that for a while, and then he laughed, out on the wet road in the dark with 20 empty wagons coming back to him from a village he had bought without drawing a sword, because willingness was the one commodity on the whole continent whose price he already knew. We were short of hands and short of food and down to a company that had been at the edge of the 9th strength before Brindle, and there was a grain convoy coming north along the wet road on the 2nd night, and Lask wanted it. 22 wagons with a light escort, moving after dark to keep the horses cool. The road runs between the hill and a wet ditch for half a mile below Brindle, and half a mile of ditch is all anybody needs. The trouble was that the ditch is black at night and the road is black at night, and the only man in the 9th who could see well enough in that dark to place people was Wick, who was 14, and Bram had already made himself clear about that, which left me with a problem that Rusk, of all people, solved by asking the wrong question. "Whose hands are you taking this time?" And I heard it the way he did not mean it, and I understood something that I had used every day since. I called the company together on the road with the light going, and I put my own hand out flat with the palm up, and I let them look at it for a while. Dane Farrow. My night eyes. To Hesk out of Brindle. Nettle came off my shoulder and took it, and the world went the color of a closed room, and I stood there blind as a mole with the whole company watching a 19-year-old learn what he had been asking of other people for 9 days. Hesk looked up at the hill and said, "Oh," and then repeated it. Rusk approved it after it had already happened, which is not how any of that was supposed to work, and he wrote his approval into the empty air with 2 fingers and went red. We took the convoy. Hesk put people in the ditch and I could not have pointed to one of them, and Asa shot from the hill by feel and by the shape of the lantern light. And Oren Rill, who had not slept in 2 days and did not need to, went along the ditch and cut every trace on every wagon in the dark. 9 wagons of rye came out of that ditch and went to Bellwater. 13 more went into the fire and the smoke of it was still going up in the morning. I contributed one thing to that fight, and the thing I contributed was to walk into my own line at a dead run because I could not see it, and take Oren's elbow across the face, and go down in the ditch water with my nose broken. He apologized for a week. I let him know it was the most useful thing anybody had done for me since the calling, and I was not being clever about it. Half the company had seen me get up out of that ditch with my face in ruins and my hands still open. That is how the road people started coming. Nobody sent them. There was no order and no proclamation and nothing written anywhere. It went along the wet road the way things go, and what went was one sentence, and the sentence was that the boy who asks pays first. The first was a widow named Cass Ober who walked 8 miles to give us her balance, because she had spent 30 years on the roof of a barn and had no fear of a height in her at all, and she wanted the man who took it to know that her son had been at Coldgate and had not come back. The second was a pair of brothers off a burned farm who gave us nothing at all and stayed anyway and dug. By the end of that week I had 16 people on the wet road who were not in the 9th, who were not being paid, and who had opened their hands in front of a boy with a broken nose, and Van Rusk had approved every one of them in his own voice, in front of the company, before anybody pushed him. And Nettle had got heavier again. She was up past a sparrow now and into something with weight to it, and she had started to reach. At Marrow she had needed both people inside a shout. On the wet road she took Cass Ober's balance from one end of a field and put it in a man at the other, and afterwards she sat on my knee and looked at her own hands, which is a thing she had never done before. Wick saw that too. Wick saw everything. She is doing what we do. What does that mean? She gets more of what she carries. What have we been giving her? I sent him to bed. Then I sat up for a long time with a small heavy thing breathing on my knee, and I thought about the ford, and the ditch, and every green thread I had put up in 19 days, and what all of it added up to inside her. I did not do anything about it. That is worth saying plainly, because it is the first of my failures that cost somebody who was not a soldier, and there was a night, right there on the wet road with my nose in splints, when I knew enough to have started asking. The order to Coldgate came 4 days after the convoy, and it came with a word in it that I had never had aimed at me before. Demonstrate. Coldgate is a grey lump of a place on a bend of the Ashen with a wall on the land side and a stair of flat stones going down to the water, and it holds the last dry crossing before the grain country. Everything north of it eats because Coldgate stands. Holisander held the river line out of Coldgate, with a quiet man called Pryor doing the running for him. 51 years old, 3 companies under him and a 4th on paper, and a way of listening that made you finish your sentence early. He had read Lask's report and Rusk's report and he had made up his mind about neither. What he wanted was the thing in front of him, on his own men, before dark. Take a man of the 4th, he said, and take a man of the 11th, and do it here, so I can see it. So I did, and it went wrong in front of everybody, and the way it went wrong was the most useful thing that happened to me that year. The giver was a big quiet fellow of the 4th named Doyle Frayne, out of Aubrey Sell's file. He opened his hand honestly. He had come from a farm outside Brindle and he had a brother back there, and I did not think about that at all on the day, and I have thought about it a great many times since. The taker was a man of the 11th whose name I did not know, and neither did Doyle. I spoke it the way I always spoke it. Nettle came off my shoulder and went across, and then she hung in the air over the space between those 2 men like a bee working out whether a flower is worth it. It took her the time it takes to eat a bowl of soup. When it landed it was thin, and it was gone by the middle of the afternoon, hours before the sun went anywhere. Holisander watched all of that without moving his face. Do it again. I did it again with 2 men of the 4th who bunked in the same row. Faster. Held better. Still slack. Then I did the thing I should have done first, and I put Tamril's wind into his brother Orrin, and it went up before I finished the last word and sat in Orrin like it had been born there. And Orrin laughed out loud on the stones because it felt, in his words, like coming home into your own house. Grange was there. Grange had ridden down from the corps to watch me fail, which he had every right to do, and instead he stood at the bottom of the stair with his bore and worked the whole thing out ahead of me. The ground between them has nothing to do with it, he said. What matters is how far apart the 2 of them stand as people. That is the whole rule and he found it, and I have never once pretended otherwise. The nearer 2 people stand to each other as people, the cheaper it goes and the longer it holds. Strangers cost 4 times and leak all day. There was one more thing on those steps and I have put it in because of what it turned into. Grange's bore came up the stair while we were still arguing about the arithmetic. It went past his leg without looking at him. It stopped 4 feet from my elbow with its head down and it stayed there until we were finished. 6 years, Grange said, flat, the way a man reads out a number. It has never followed anybody. It does not follow me. Then he stood at the bottom of that stair with his hands at his sides and looked at the thing on my arm for a long while, and he did not say one word more that day about instruments of the corps. Holisander did the arithmetic in his head faster than any of us and did not like the reply. Then it does not scale. I have got 900 men on this river and they do not know each other and they are not going to. I put it to him for a day. He gave me until dark, which was 6 hours, and Dovamarsh took those 6 hours and ran them like a village dance, and I have never in my life seen anything funnier or more efficient. She put the 4th and the 11th into pairs by height, because height was the only thing she could sort them by quickly, and she made every pair sit down opposite each other with a bowl between them and get 3 things out of the other man before they were allowed to stand up. Name. Somebody at home. One thing you are frightened of. The fourth thought it was a punishment. Then somebody found out that the tall miserable article across from him had married his cousin's widow, and after that you could not stop them. The 11th had a man called Denny Mott who would not give the third thing for 2 hours. He gave it at dusk. He was frightened of horses, and he had been in a war for 3 years, and he had told nobody, and the man opposite him put both hands over his face and howled with laughter and then swore on his mother that he would never repeat it. He never did repeat it. He gave that man his own steadiness on the stair 6 days later and got a broken collarbone for the trouble. Hesk went round with the bulls. Wick went round writing nothing down and remembering everything, and Pell went round with one arm, telling men that if they thought this was undignified they should try the other way, and holding up the sleeve. Dova's contribution to the proceedings, offered at volume to a yard full of grown men, was that half of them had been to the same 3 houses in Bellwater and could work out their common ground from there if the bulls were too slow. By dark I could put a thread between any pair in that yard in the time it takes to say it, and it held to sunset, and Hollis Anders stood at the top of the stair and watched 12 of them go up one after another with his hands behind his back. He did not congratulate me. What he said was worth more. You have shown me that my river runs on whether my men have eaten soup together. I do not know yet whether I am pleased or terrified. Then he gave the 9th the cattle stair, which is the stepped crossing a mile below Coldgate, and told us to hold it while he moved his grain, and he gave us the 4th to do it with. That was the highest I stood in the whole war before it went over. 19 years old, a company and a half under my naming, a fortress commander asking my opinion, and a thing on my shoulder that had grown too heavy to sit on my collarbone and had taken to writing in the crook of my elbow. 9 days later I stood on those same stones and spoke a man's name and nothing happened at all. Corvain's answer came up the river ahead of his army, and it came in the shape of 41 men we had given up for dead. He had taken them at Brindle and at the convoy and at 2 places on the wet road, and he had fed them for a fortnight, and he had let every one of them go with their boots on and a day's bread in no conditions of any kind. That is what he did. That is all he did. He sent our own people back to us, healthy, and let them talk. They talked. Why would they not talk? They had been treated better in a fortnight of captivity than in a year of their own service, and they said so, and men listened. And in among it, carried by men who had no idea they were carrying anything, went 4 true statements. The ferry takes something real out of you. You get it back at sunset. You get back a little less each time. And the best shot on the Ashen, Osakiel, who put 9 into 9 at Marrow, cannot hold a cup at 40 paces anymore. Every word of that was true. That is what made it a weapon. I could not stand up in front of the 4th and call a released prisoner a liar, because he was not lying, and Dova Marsh had made me promise at the Rylands that I would not start. Asa heard her own name coming back to her off other men's mouths for 3 days before she came and found me. Say it to my face. You are not what you were. How much? I did not know how much. That was the honest answer, and it was the worst thing I could have given her. She stood there with her hands at her sides and worked it out for herself, the way she works everything out, and then she went and put 4 into a post at 40 paces and 3 of them went where she wanted. 3 out of 4, from the woman who had never in 12 years given anybody a reason to look at the second arrow. She did not shout at me. She went and sat with her nephew and let Wick talk at her about nothing for an hour, and I stood on the wall at Coldgate and understood that I had spent 19 days spending something that had a bottom. So what was I supposed to decide, and where? Corvain came at the cattle stair before I had a reply, and he came in the afternoon, in the open, with his infantry in the water and no cleverness at all, because he did not need cleverness by then. The stair is 7 flat stones with a drop on either side and a killing width of 4 abreast. Hold the top and you hold the crossing. To hold the top I needed a wall of men who would not step back, and I had that, and I needed one thing in the middle of it that I did not have. Their front rank came up the stones behind big oval shields with the river taking the men on the outside and washing them away, and they took that loss and kept coming, and our line bent at the 4th stone where a man named Sowerby went down with a spear in his hip. I needed Doyle Frane's shoulders and a smaller man who was standing in the gap, and Doyle Frane was 6 feet away from me with a shield in his hands and his mouth working. Doyle Frane. Your shoulders. To Aunce Cobb. And his hand stayed shut. I have gone over that afternoon more times than any other, and here is what was in it, and none of it was cowardice. His brother Cole was in Brindle. Brindle was Harrow now. One of the 41 that Corvain sent back had come through Brindle on the way and had seen the forge running and Doyle's brother working it, alive and fed, and had told Doyle so on the wall at Coldgate 2 nights before. And Doyle Frane had eaten soup opposite a man of the 11th and learned the names of his children, and had liked all of it, and had worked out during that soup that this whole thing runs on people being willing, and that the far end of willing is a woman who cannot hold a cup at 40 paces. So he stood on the fourth stone of the cattle stair with his hand shut and his eyes wet, and he held his own ground with his own shoulders, and he did not give them to anybody. Was he wrong? He was not. He was the first person on our side of the war to be right about me before I was. Van Rusk did the thing that everybody who has authority does once, and he did it at a shout, and he ordered the man to open his hand. Doyle opened it. He opened it flat and wide and he held it out, and Nettle came off my elbow and hung over it for 3 long seconds and would not touch him, because an open hand is not the same thing as an open hand, and she has never once in her life been fooled about which is which. I would have paid a great deal for the men on that stair to have learned that on a different day. We lost the cattle stair in about a quarter of an hour after that. Hans Cobb went off the fourth stone backwards into the water with his mouth open. Sowerby died where he had gone down. The fourth broke on the sixth stone and ran up the bank and reformed, which is more than most companies manage, and Hollisander burned the grain barges at the top of the reach himself rather than leave them. 9 of ours dead on the stones, 6 more in the water, and every one of them had watched a boy stand at the top of a crossing with a thing on his elbow and say a name into a silence. That is the picture that went up and down the Ashen after the cattle stair. Not the ford. Not the convoy. A silence, and a ferry that would not move. Wick came up the bank afterwards through the smoke of the barges with his hand already out flat, 14 years old, palm up, fingers spread, and his aunt 50 paces behind him not yet aware of what he was doing. Take it. Take anything. Take my wind, take my legs, I do not care. And I said no. I said no because Bram O'Dell had told me on the second night at Marrow that he would not have children in it, and he had meant it more than he meant most things, because Asakeel had already paid more than anybody, and because the boy was standing in front of me offering himself in a war where I had already learned what the bottom of a person looks like. He went white. He walked away up the bank past his aunt without stopping, and he did not speak to me for 2 days, and I thought I had done a good thing. That night Hollisander asked me what I intended to do, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. The trouble is not on the stones, I said. By the time we are on the stones it has already been decided somewhere else, by somebody who was fed for a fortnight and let go. Then go and decide it somewhere else. Hollisander went off to write to the grain country about the crossing he had lost. What I decided that night was the only move I had, and it was a bad one, and it was better than the alternative, and both of those things stayed true for the rest of the war. If Corvain's whole weapon was the truth about my price, then I would get there first. Every time. Before the asking, in front of whoever was standing there, including the parts that made me look like a man who spends people. Lask hated it. Rusk went the color of his own toad. You are going to stand in front of the fourth. You are going to give them the woman who saved a ford and cannot shoot anymore. And then you want their hands? Yes. They will laugh at you and go home. Then where are you? Some of them will. I did it the next morning on the stones below Coldgate with the fourth drawn up and Hollisander at the top of the stair with his hands behind his back, and I have never been so frightened of anything I have done since, including the last day. I gave them what it takes and what comes back and what does not. I gave them Asakeel by name, with Asakeel standing 40 paces away, because I had put it to her the night before and she had given me the word. And I gave them the thing nobody had made me give, which is that I did not know where the bottom was, that I had watched Nettle hesitate on a wrist at Marrow Ford on the second night, and that I had chosen not to look at it because I needed the thread. That last part cost me more than the rest of it together. You can be a man who names a hard price. Being a man who saw the hard price coming and looked away is a different animal. About half the fourth went cold on me in the space of a minute. You could watch it happen down the ranks like frost. The road people came apart faster. Of the 16 on the wet road, 9 went home inside a week, and one of them was Cass Ober, who came and gave me back nothing, because there was nothing to give back, and stood there with her hands at her sides for a while and then walked off up the road toward the barn she had spent 30 years on. Who could blame her? Her son had gone into Coldgate and never come out, and she had come 8 miles to make that mean something, and I had stood on a stone and explained to her that meaning it costs a piece of you that does not grow back. So that was the loss, and it took 4 days, and I counted it every morning like a man checking a wound. Here is the other half. On the 5th day Hesk came up the wet road with 31 people behind him. They were Brindle, not the Brindle that stayed and took the rye. These were the ones who had walked out of the square the night the elders decided, with what they could carry, and had been camped in the wet woods above the pond ever since, because there is nowhere on that road for people who belong to nobody. Meg Fallow led them, with her sister's boy Jory carrying the pot, and Meg had run the brindle pond and the fish out of it for 16 years, and she had a way of standing that made you check whether you had done something. Hesk had gone to them on his own. He had walked 12 miles in the dark to the woods above his own village, and he had given them my price exactly the way I give it, including Asa, including the bottom I could not find. Why? That is what I wanted to know when they came up the road. Half the fourth had gone cold at that speech, and here were 31 strangers who had heard the same words and walked 12 miles toward it. Meg Fallow gave me the reason, and it is the most useful sentence anybody gave me in the war. The man with the wagons never named what it cost. That was it. Corvain had put 20 wagons of rye in a square and met every question honestly except one, and the one was what Brindle would be paying, and it turned out that some people notice the shape of a hole in a story even when they cannot name what belongs in it. They had watched their elders take the rye. They had watched Tor Yale decide for his own apprentice in front of the village without turning round. And a fortnight later a boy on a stone in Coldgate had stood up and given the fourth the worst thing about himself. 31 of them, out of a village of 300. It is not a lot. They were the ones who could not be bought, and they had walked out with nothing to prove it, and I would rather have had those 31 than the fourth entire. Meg opened her hand on the road without being prompted and let me take whatever I liked, so long as I named it first. I took her steadiness for one night and put it into a man of the fourth who was going out on a wire party, and I gave it back to her at sunset with my own mouth, out loud, in front of her people, which is a thing I started doing then and never stopped. Grange watched every bit of it from the top of the stair. He had ridden down to take the measure of the method for the corps, and he had stayed 9 days, and he had seen the cattle stare go, and he had seen a boy give a whole company his own worst fact and gain 31 people out of a village that had already sold itself. He wrote to Coldgate the same evening, and he wrote what he had seen, honestly, because whatever else Grange was, he did not put false things on paper. And what he wrote, in the plainest terms he could manage, was that the method now belonged to whoever heard it, that it worked on people the corps had no hold over, and that a 19-year-old with no rank was building something out of civilians on the wet road that belonged to him and to nobody above him. Every word of that was true as well. It is remarkable how much damage gets done by people telling the exact truth about me. Asakiel's hands never came back. It was the 11th evening after the cattle stare, and there was no fight that day and no threat up, and the sun went down over the grain country the way it does, orange and long, and she was sitting on the wall with her bow across her knees, waiting the way she had waited every dusk since Marrow. We all knew she waited. Nobody had ever put a word to it. I was 50 paces along the wall when I saw her stand up and take 3 arrows out and shoot at the mark on the barn door, and I knew from the sound of the third one hitting that it had not come back. She shot the whole quiver. Then she went and pulled them and shot it again. Wick got to her before I did. He was 14 and he had been running errands for the fourth all day, and he came up that ladder like a cat, and he stood next to his aunt and did not touch her, which was the right thing, and I have wondered since who taught him that. When I got there she had her back to the parapet and her hands open in front of her, looking at them. There is a version of me with something ready. I did not have it that evening. It was in the rule from the start, I said. I know. I saw it on the second night at Marrow. She went slow on your wrist and I called it tired. I know that as well. I was there. Then she stood up and did the thing I had been afraid of since the cattle stare, and she did it without any heat at all, which made it worse. My name is finished, she said. You do not use it again. Not to me, not to the fourth, not to a village, not to 31 people on a road. If you want to give them the price, give them a woman and leave her out of it. I put it to her that her name was the reason the Brindle people came. I know what my name is worth to you. That is why you are not having it. She was inside her rights, and she was also cutting the tendon of the only policy that had worked, and both of those were true at once, and I stood on that wall and could not think of one honest word to put against it. She stayed with the 9th. That has to go in, because it would be easy to leave the impression that she went off somewhere. Asakiel stayed, and she ran the wire parties and the night pickets and the water, and she was good at it, and it was not what she was. The bow went to a man of the fourth 2 days later. She did not make a speech about it. She walked over, gave it to him, showed him where it pulled, and walked back. The trouble with a woman like that giving up her bow is that everybody in 2 companies watches it happen, and everybody works out the arithmetic on their own, and I did not need one word about the price for a fortnight after that. I lost givers all the same. Of course I did. And I gain one that I did not want and should have refused, and that is the next thing, and it is mine. Wick started putting himself in the way of it before his aunt's bow had changed hands. He would stand where I could see him with his hand half open. He would find reasons to be at my elbow when a thread went up. He learned the shape of the sentence I use and he would run the first half of it under his breath. My name, his name, the thing, waiting for the day. Bram saw it before I did and warned me twice. Bram was not subtle about it either time. That boy has one aunt and no mother and he watched her lose her hands for you, and he has worked out that the way to be worth something in this company is to hand yourself over. Do not take it. I promised I would not. I want to be clear that I promised, that I meant the promise, and that 8 days later I did it anyway, in the dark, with a good reason, which is how these things get done. Corvain started a bridge below Coldgate at a place the Carters call Clayford, where the Ashen goes wide and shallow over clay. He built it the way he did everything, in the open, with paid men and no hurry. 60 flat-bottomed boats chained nose to tail with a plank rowed across the top of them, anchored upstream against the current with cable as thick as my wrist. Once that bridge stood he did not need the cattle stair or Coldgate or any crossing at all. He could put his whole army over the Ashen in a day and be in the grain country before the frost. Halisander tried fire twice and lost the men both times. The boats were wet clay-bottomed things and the guard on the far bank was awake. What was left was the cable. Cut the upstream anchor cables and the current does the rest, and 60 boats go down the Ashen sideways in the dark and pile up on the shallows at Coldgate where our own people can burn them at leisure. The cables are under 4 feet of moving water at the bottom of a clay bank in the middle of the night, and a man has to be down there long enough to work a saw through wet rope, and come up, and go down again, 6 times. Tamrill had those lungs. Tamrill was at Bellwater with a broken foot from a wagon, which is the stupidest and most ordinary reason in the world for what happened next. Oren was there. Oren without his brother is a man with one lung and no patience. He tried it and came up at 4 cuts and could not go down again. We had until the moon came round the shoulder of the hill, which was about 2 hours, and I stood on that clay bank going through the whole of the 9th and the 4th in my head looking for a pair of lungs and finding none of them good enough. Wick had his hand out flat before I got to the end of the list. He had come down with the water, which he had no business doing. He was standing in the mud with his palm up and his fingers spread. His face was doing the thing a boy's face does when he has decided something on his own and is frightened it will be taken away from him. Take it. I can hold my breath for a slow 90. I did it in the pond at Brindle all summer. Ask Hesk. Hesk, from the dark, backed him. Bram said one word from the top of the bank, and the word was no, and I heard it. Here is my defense, and it is a real one, and it is not good enough. If that bridge stood, Corvain crossed. If Corvain crossed, he was in the grain country in 4 days, and the grain country is Bellwater, and Bellwater is where the river house is, and there were about 200 children in Bellwater who were what I had been. I had a boy in front of me with his hand open and his own reason, and I had a bridge, and I had 2 hours. Wick. Your wind. To Oren Rill. I have written that sentence out once and I am not writing it again. The thread went up green and short because they were close, and Oren Rill went back into that water like an otter and cut every cable on the string, 6 of them, and came up the 6th time with the saw gone and his hands split open, and the whole line of boats came off the anchor together with a sound like a barn falling down. 60 boats went down the Ashen sideways in the dark. 2 of them stayed on the shallows at Coldgate long enough to burn, and the fire was up the whole reach by first light, and Halisander stood on his wall and watched a season of Corvain's carpentry go past him in pieces. Was it good work? It was the best night's work I ever did. I would do the bridge again tomorrow. And on the clay bank, 30 paces behind all that, a 14-year-old boy sat down in the mud because he could not stand up and had to be carried to the top by Hesk, and spent the next hour learning what it is to have nothing in your chest. It came back at sunset the following evening. Most of it. He was quick and he was clever and he lied about the rest for 12 days. He would run a message and stop round a corner where nobody could see him and stand with his hands on his knees, and then come in at a jog looking fine. Dova caught him at it. Dova brought it to me. I put it to the boy and he looked me in the face and swore he was fine, and I let it go, because I wanted it to be true and because the alternative was a thing I would have to carry. He never got the last of it back. Wick could not run 20 paces at the end of that autumn without going grey, and he was 14, and he had given it to me himself with his own hand out flat, which does not help at all and I have stopped expecting it to. What it did to him is the thing I did not see coming. He did not go quiet. He went the other way. A boy who has worked out that the one thing he owns worth having is his own body will keep offering it, and he will offer it faster each time, because the first one hurt and the second one is easier. He came at me for it again 8 days later. He did it in front of people, so that refusing him would be public. That is a trick a grown man uses. Bram never mentioned it to me again. That was the worst of it. He had said no from the top of a clay bank and I had gone over him, and after that he did not raise it once, and he went on standing next to me in front of the company for another 11 weeks. And Nettle changed. I did not have the words for it then. What I noticed was small. She stopped waiting on my elbow for a name. She would come off my arm before I had opened my mouth and go and sit on somebody. Not at random. She would pick the person I was about to name, one time in 3, then one time in 2, and she would sit on that shoulder and wait for me to catch up. Wick noticed it before it got that far, because Wick noticed everything, even with no wind in him. She is choosing, he said. She is guessing. Guessing at what? She has no idea what the bridge is. She does not know what a cable is. She looked at that bank and picked Oren out of that whole bank and she was right. I gave him the easy answer, that a thing which has carried 900 threads has probably learned what a giver looks like, and that this was no stranger than a dog knowing which pocket the bread is in. He accepted that, because he was 14 and he was tired and I was the one who was supposed to know. I have thought since about what else she might have been learning off 900 threads, and about the fact that every single one of them went through the middle of her, and that she keeps what she carries, and that I had spent a whole autumn deciding what to put through her without once asking what was piling up on the inside. The man who changed the war was a Harrow Bridge guard we pulled out of the water with a broken arm, and his name was Sarn, and he was 38 years old and he mended nets before all this. We took 4 of them off the shallows that night. 3 gave us the usual, which is name and nothing, and I have no complaint about that, it is what I would do. Sarn gave us nothing either, for a day and a half, and he did it politely, which is worse. Hollisander wanted him worked on. Lask said no and Rusk said no, and I wanted on the record that the corpsman and the 9th agreed about that in the same breath, and that Hollisander did not push it. So I went and sat with him instead, because I had nothing better to do and because he was the only person in Coldgate who had seen Corvain inside a week. He wanted to know what the thing on my arm was. Everybody wants to know. I had given it to a company of the 4th and 31 Brindle people and a widow at a mill, and by then I had the words worn smooth, so I gave him the whole of it in order, the same as always. What it takes. What comes back. What does not. And the woman? There was a woman who was the best shot on this river and now she is not. I do not use her name. He sat with his arm strapped across his chest and looked out of the window slit at the grey water for a long time. Then he wanted to know something else, and it was not what I expected. Would it work on me? I had never once thought about it. That is the honest truth and it is not to my credit. In 19 days I had thought about givers and thresholds and distance and erosion, and I had never once checked whether the rule I had built my whole autumn on cared which side of a river a man was born on, because it seemed obvious and I let it stand. I do not know, I said. Sarn had a twin, and the twin was called Rin. Rin had stayed on the Calder bank when the border villages went over, and he had been in Barrowgate's levee at the cattle stare 3 weeks before, and he had gone into the water off the 6th stone, and Sarn had that from a man named Beck who came home in Corvain's fortnight of kindness and could not stop talking about it. His brother had died holding a crossing against Sarn's own army, and Sarn had spent the whole autumn guarding a bridge and being paid on time and not dying for bread, exactly as promised. He put his good hand out flat on the table between us with the palm up and the fingers spread. Then find out, he said. I want to describe exactly what happened in that room, because a great many people have described it since and most of them were not there. There was no light and no sound and nothing came off the walls. Nettle came off my arm the way she comes off my arm, and she landed on a Harrow Bridge guard's open hand, and she took his grip. I put it into Van Rusk, who was standing in the doorway, because Van Rusk was the nearest person and because I could not think. Rusk's hand closed on the doorframe and took a piece of it out. The 4 of us stood there, a Harrow prisoner and a corboy and a 19-year-old and a thing the size of a small cat, and understood the same thing at the same moment. She does not know what a flag is. She has never known. Nobody had put it to her, because for 19 days every hand I put in front of her had happened to be on our side of a river. Rusk put into words what the 3 of us were standing there thinking, with his hand still in the doorframe. Every man in his army can give. Yes. Every man in his army that we can get within a shout of and speak to like a person. Yes. He is going to have to keep them away from you, Rusk said. He is going to have to keep his whole army from standing close enough to a boy to hear one sentence out of him. And then Finn Rusk, who had said no for 6 days and had ordered an open hand shot on the cattle stare and had been wrong about me for a month, started to laugh, and could not stop, and had to sit down on the floor of a cell with his ruined hand in his lap. Sarn got his grip back at sunset. Did it hurt? I wanted to know. He held the hand up and turned it over and said that it felt like a night on it, and nothing worse than that, and had I ever tried asking a man instead of guessing at him? He wanted a job. Holisander gave him the nets and the boat gear at Coldgate, which is what he had done before the war, and he was still doing it when I saw him for the last time. He never fought for us. Not one day. He gave 4 more times before the frost and every one of them mattered, and he sent word across to his cousins Petch and Wold at Clayford about what a boy at Coldgate gives you when you put the question. What have you got to lose, he wrote them. He has already told you the worst of it himself. That is how it started leaking. Not with a battle. With a man who mended nets letting his cousins know that the other side does not hide the cost. By the end of that week we had Harrow men on our bank, 11 of them, who had come over to open a hand and go back, and 9 of them did go back. And I learned more about Corvain's dispositions from what those 9 were willing to give me than Holisander's scouts had learned in a month. Willingness gives you everything. A man who will give you his night eyes and not his steadiness is a man who was frightened of something specific, and if you put it to him while his hand is still open he will usually give it. Corvain heard about Sarn 6 days later, and by then he had lost the bridge and a season's worth of carpentry, and the confidence of his own crossing guards, and he did the thing that made him the best commander I ever went against. He did not tighten discipline. He did not hang anybody. He did not forbid his men to talk to us, because he understood in about an hour that a forbidden thing on a river bank is a thing that happens at night. He sat down and worked out what the boy's machine ran on, all the way to the bottom, the way he had worked out what a village runs on. It runs on people being willing. And a willing man will give you whatever he has got in him. And there is a great deal in men that nobody in their right mind would want to carry. Within a fortnight of Sarn I had a problem I had never once imagined having, and it was the best problem of my life. Too many open hands. 31 brindle people. What was left of the road folk? 200 of the 4th who had come round after the cattle stare. 9 Harrow men from Clayford who rode across in the dark to give and rode back before light, and 7 more behind them who were thinking about it, and 1 thread at a time. Whatever a fight needed, how many could I put up? 1, and while it was up I was a boy standing in a field with a heavy insect on his arm and 100 people holding their hands out at me for nothing. Wick worked out where the wall was, because Wick worked out most things about her before I did, and by then he could not run 20 paces without going grey and he had a great deal of sitting down time to think in. Everything she has grown on his weight, he said. 900 threads and she went from a leaf to that. So what has she never had? I had no idea. Nothing has ever stayed, he said. Every single thing she has ever carried went back at sunset. She has been a road, and roads do not get bigger from traffic. What happens if something stops in her? There is a version of this where I was clever. In that version I reasoned it out and tested it carefully. What happened was that a 14-year-old with no wind in him let me know that a thing which has only ever been passed through has never once been given anything, and I sat there with my mouth open like a fish. We tried it the next day, and it was the single funniest hour I ever spent in that company, and I want it in here because most of what comes after is not funny at all. The word went round that the boy needed something given forever, and about 60 people formed up to volunteer, and it turned into a market at a country fair. Hesk offered his hair. Is hair a thing of the body or is it rubbish, he wanted to know. She would not touch it, which settled it. A man of the 4th offered a toad he had never liked the look of, and a boy from Farron offered his singing voice, and what use is that on a wet slope? Oren Rill offered, at volume, a specific and personal thing that he claimed had brought him nothing but trouble since he was 15, and the 4th went down like a barn. And Dovamarsh explained to him at even greater volume that the trouble in question had never once been located where he thought it was and that his mother had opinions about it too. Nettle sat on the rail through all of it with her wings folded and would not lift for one of them. Because none of it was true. A man does not give away his hair. He mislays it. And a thing given for a laugh in front of your friends is a thing you have already worked out you can live without, which is the exact opposite of the trade. She took nothing all afternoon, and by dusk the fair had gone quiet, and men had started to understand what was actually being asked for and had stopped putting their hands up. Bram O'Dell came down to the rail at dark with his coat off. I want to put down exactly what he had, because it is the thing the ninth was built on and nobody had ever named it. Bram was the calm one. That was his whole nature. In 11 years nobody in that company had seen his hands move faster than his voice. When a line was about to go, Bram would walk down the back of it at a stroll, and men who were 3 seconds from running would look at him and decide to stay for another minute, and then another one. It was not courage. There were braver men in the ninth. It was that nothing in him ever went quickly, and being near it slowed you down. He put his hand out flat and gave me the word for it himself. My quiet. Not until sunset. For good. I argued badly and for a long time, and I brought up his son and I brought up the 11 years and I brought up the fact that the ninth without him is a mob with a name, and he let me get all the way to the end of it. Then he gave me 2 reasons, in his order. The first was arithmetic and I could not fault it. 1 thread means I choose 1 man a day and everybody else goes without. If she can hold 30, then his quiet buys 30 men who do not lose anything at all, every day, for the rest of the war, and 30 is more than 1, and he had been doing that some since the cattle stare. The second reason he gave me quietly, with his back to the rail, and it took me a year to understand it. I said no on that clay bank and you went over me. Fine. You had the bridge and I had a rule and the bridge was real. But I have stood next to you in front of this company since Marrow saying that you are worth opening a hand for, and I have not opened mine once. A man cannot keep vouching on credit. Then he put it to me whether I was going to make him stand there all night. Bram O'Dell. You're quiet. To her. What does a gift with no sunset look like? Nothing like the others. There was no line of light going anywhere. She came off my arm and landed on his open palm and stayed there, and the 2 of them were still for a long time, longer than any thread I have ever run, and Bram's face went through something I could not follow. And then she got heavy. I could hear it. The rail took her weight and complained about it. When she came off his hand she was the size of a hunting hawk, and her wings had gone from that hedge-torn moth thing to something that made a sound in the air, and her eyes had white in them for the first time since she came out of the chalk. Bram sat down on the ground. He was never the same and he never pretended otherwise. My father, if I had one, would have been about his age. What Bram O'Dell became that night was an old man who flinched. A dropped pan would take him off the ground. He could not stand behind people anymore. In a bad hour his hands went and he would put them in his armpits the way Asa had done on the gravel at Marrow, and the 2 of them sat together a great deal that winter and did not talk about it. The ninth kept following him. That is the thing that saved us for another 6 weeks. 11 years of habit does not come off a company because the man's hands shake, and Bram knew that when he opened his palm, and he used it up to the last day of it. Then Rusk came and found me at first light with his moss-toad held out in both hands like a man bringing evidence to a table. It was a color I had never seen on it, and it had been that color since dark, and it was not afraid. What is it doing? It is looking at her. It has done nothing else all night and it will not eat. Then Rusk gave me the question that ended up in his report, and he gave it politely, because he did everything politely. What is she now? I told him she was a level 1 fairy, because that is what the yard had said in front of everybody, and I had nothing better to give him. He wrote nothing down, and he went and sat where he could see the rail she was on with the toad in his lap going on being that color, and the pair of them were still there when the sun came up. What we got for him, I will not pretend was small, and I am not going to pretend either that I had done the sum before he opened his hand. 2 days later, on a wet slope above the wet road, I put 9 threads up at once and held them for the length of a fight. 9. Sarn's grip into a man on a wire. Meg Fallow's steadiness into a boy from the 4th who had never stood in a line before. Hesk's shoulders, Petch's night eyes, a harrow rower's wind, all of them live at the same moment, all of them going back at sunset. The file we hit came apart in about 4 minutes and could not work out why. They had looked us over on the way up the slope and the arithmetic had been theirs. By the end of that week I could run 30 at once if the pairs knew each other, and every one of those 30 came out of somebody who had walked to me on their own feet. That is the closest I came to being what people afterwards said I was. Corvain's answer arrived 9 days later and it came smiling. They came across at Clayford in daylight, in 4s and 5s, unarmed, with their hands already open before they were up the bank. Harrow men. Volunteers, not deserters, and that is the thing that took me too long to understand. Every one of them went back across before dark and reported in and drew their rations. Corvain had put it to his army straight, the way he put everything straight. The boy at Coldgate will take a thing out of a man and use it and give it back at sunset. Go and give him something. Give him the worst thing you have got in you. You will be rid of it for a day, and he will have it, and I would like to see what he does with it." The first one was a man named Halder who had a face like a farm and a voice to match, and he sat down on our bank and told me exactly what he was offering, because by then everybody on that river knew the rule about lying. "I have a thing in me that does not stop at a door," he said. "I have had it since the spring. It has been 3 villages now, and I have not slept right since the second one, and I would like one day without it in me." I want to be honest about what went through me in that moment, and it was not horror. It was arithmetic, because a thing that does not stop at a door is worth a great deal in a fight, and I had a slope to take at 9 Barrow and a company that had been holding a wet line for a fortnight, and here was a man handing it over of his own accord with his hand flat and his eyes wet. Halder. The thing in you that does not stop. To Doyle Frayne. Doyle Frayne had opened his hand for me at last. That is what makes this the worst thing I did. He had held his fist shut at the cattle stare and been right, and he had spent 5 weeks watching me tell people the truth about the price, and on the morning of 9 Barrow he came and found me and put his hand out flat and told me he had thought about it long enough. He took Halder's thing up that slope and we carried the position in 20 minutes with 2 hurt. And then he went on down the back of the hill into the wagon lines, where the drivers were, and the drivers were not soldiers, and it took 4 men of the 4th to get him off the last of them, and by then it did not matter. He came back to himself at sunset in the mud with his hands in front of his face. Corbane's man Halder got his thing back the same minute across the river and by all accounts slept for the first time in months. We do not know what happened to Doyle Frayne after that winter. He walked out of the camp at 9 Barrow in the dark and he did not take anything with him, and Meg Fallow was the last one to see him on the road, and he would not stop when she called. I took 9 more of those gifts before I stopped. I want that written where it can be seen. Not 1. 9. And the fights went well, and the line held, and I told myself every time that the man giving it wanted rid of it and that the man taking it was volunteering. Nettle changed on that diet the way a dog changes on meat. It was not sudden. If it had been sudden I would have stopped. She got quicker. She stopped waiting for me at all and started going to the giver while I was still deciding, and she was right so often that I let it become the way we worked. When had she last slept in the thimble? I could not have told you the day. She stopped going into it at night. The thimble was too small for her by then in any case, and Wick had stopped offering it, and I had not noticed him stop. And there was a way she looked at a line of men now. I had seen that look before, on a core horse buyer at Bellwater going down a row of animals. Dova Marsh was the first to say it, and she said it to my face in front of the fire, and she did not shout, which frightened me more than anything else that autumn. "I have been in a burned village," she said. "I know what a thing looks like when it has been in one. Your girl has been in 9 of them now, in the middle of them, and she carried every one of them home in her chest, and she likes it." Then she went and slept on the far side of the camp, and after that she would not eat where Nettle was, and Meg Fallow's people started doing the same by 1s and 2s without anybody saying a word about it. Wick would still sit with her. Wick sat with her when nobody else would, with no wind in his chest and a thimble in his pocket he had stopped offering. "She is still in there," he said. "How do you know? Would she take from a shut hand now, with all that in her? She still will not. She could. Look at her. She could take anything off anybody in this camp and she still sits there waiting for a palm to open. That is her. That has not moved." He was right, and it was the only true comfort anybody gave me that month, and it was also the thing that made me understand at last that everything else in her had moved. Van Rusk wrote his report on the 5th of the frost, and I have never held it against him for 1 hour. He wrote what he had seen, in order, honestly, the way Grange had written his and the way I had told the 4th mine. He wrote about 9 Barrow. He wrote Doyle Frayne's name and the wagon lines and the number of drivers. And he wrote the sentence that finished us, which was that in his judgment the spirit at Coldgate was accumulating what passed through it, that it was no longer possible to describe it as a level 1 anything, and that its keeper had continued to accept gifts of that nature after the first result was known to him. Was any of it false? Every word of it was true. I have said this before about people who ruined me and I will keep saying it. Then he came and found me and told me what he had sent, before it had gone a mile, so that I would have 3 days. "Why? Because I am not a liar," he said, "and because you are not either, and because those 2 facts are about to cost us both everything, and I wanted to look at you when it happened." The order came down on the 9th. Grange brought it, and Grange was not enjoying it, and he did not do a single thing to make it worse. The spirit was to be sealed and confined at the courthouse at Coldgate under 2 keepers. Its keeper was to be held pending an examination of his conduct at 9 Barrow. I had 3 days and I used 2 of them arguing and 1 of them running. Lask made her choice on the second evening, in a tent, with Hollis Anders' man waiting outside for a reply, and she made it the way she made everything, late and completely. She had spent her whole career learning to write upward so that nobody upstairs would ask questions. She wrote the last one of those that night. It said that the 9th had marched at dawn on her order and that its whereabouts were not known to her, and that she would surrender herself at Coldgate on the 10th. Then she went out and told the company to be gone by first light. She surrendered on the 10th. They took her place from her and they were not gentle about it, and Hollis Ander could not stop it because it had gone above him by then. I did not see Marin Lask again for 4 months. So on the 10th of the frost, the 9th was not a company. We were 140 people on the wet road with no bread, no crossings, no orders, and no country. Bram O'Dell who flinched, Asa Keel who could not shoot, Wick who could not run, Hesk out of a village that had sold itself, 31 Brindle people, Meg Fallow, Dova Marsh, 40 of the 4th who came anyway, and a hawk-sized thing that men had stopped sitting near. And Grange, who rode after us on the 11th, on his own, with his bore and no orders at all, and who did not explain himself then and never has. Corvain had the Ashen. Coldgate had a keeper and no ferry. Bellwater had 4 days of grain in it, and I had a creature on my arm that had been fed 9 burned villages by a man who understood exactly what he was doing, and I had done the feeding myself, 1 honest volunteer at a time. The thing I could not stop looking at was the sum. She keeps what she carries. She had carried Asa's nerve and Bram's quiet and Meg Fallow's steadiness and a widow's 14 sleepless months, and she had also carried the thing in Halder that did not stop at a door, 9 times over, and none of it had ever come out of her. You cannot take it back out. There is no line in the rule for that. What goes in goes in. What you can do is put more in. I put it to Wick first, sitting on a bank at the edge of the Harrow country, because he had found the last 3 things before I had. If she is made of what goes through her, then she is a bucket, and a bucket that has had 9 bad things in it needs 900 good ones. And where are you going to get 900 of those? I pointed across the water. Corvain's own people were the reply, and they had been the reply for a month, and I had been too busy winning to look at them. His country had lost its harvest and he had promised that not one of his soldiers would die for bread, and he had kept it, and he had done it by buying grain with everything his country had. The people who had grown that grain were not soldiers. There were 11,000 of them on the roads of the Harrow side that autumn, in camps at Vessel Ford and Ambry and along the Salt Road, being fed on what was left after an army had been fed first. They were not going to give me a thing that does not stop at a door. They did not have one. They had been walking since the summer with their children and they had run out of nearly everything. Except one thing, and it is the thing nobody thinks of as a possession until they meet somebody who has none of it. I crossed at Clayford on the 14th with Sarn Rowing, and Hesk, and Meg Fallow, and Wick, who would not be left, and no weapons at all, and we walked into the camp at Ambry in the middle of the afternoon. There were about 2,000 of them in that field. A woman named Ceylon was running the water end of it, an old man called Dens had the fires, and a cartwoman named Bet Croy had 6 orphans off the Salt Road sleeping under her axle. And neither of them had any authority whatever except that they had been doing it for 6 weeks and were still upright. I said what I had come for, and I said it the same way I had said it to the 4th and to Brindle, which meant I said the price first, and the price was strange enough that Ceylon made me say it twice. I do not want your strength. I do not want anybody's hands. I want your patience. The thing that gets you through a 5th week in a wet field, and through a morning at the water barrel, without hitting somebody. You will be without it until sunset, and you will feel it, and there are children here, so think about that before anybody opens anything. What are you going to do with it? That is what Dens wanted to know, and he wanted to know it in front of everybody, and he was right too. I gave him the truth, which was that I was going to put it in a creature that had been fed on the worst thing men have in them, 9 times, by my own mouth, and that I did not know whether this would work. Nobody moved for a while. It was a very long while. Then Ceylon opened her hand, and after her the boy at her elbow, and after him a man who had walked from the Salt Road with his mother on a handcart, and after him Bet Croy, who made her 6 orphans stand back while she did it, and by the time the light went there were 400 open hands in that field and they were still coming across it in the dark. I ran them until my voice went. Wick kept the tally for me until he could not stand up, and Meg Fallow took over, and Hess carried people's children about so that their mothers could keep their hands free. 411 threads in one evening. Every one of them light, every one of them the same small dull unglamorous thing. She went dark and heavy and quiet in the middle of it, and stopped moving on her own, and sat on my forearm through the last 200 with her wings shut and her head down like something being washed, and when the sun came up she was clean. What else do you call it? I have no better word and no proof. She was clean, and she was bigger again, and she looked at the field of them the way she had looked at the ninth on the second night at Marrow, and she went across and sat on Ceylon's shoulder without being asked, and stayed there for an hour, which is a thing she had never done for anybody in her life. I sat on a handcart in a field of Corvain's starving people and understood the last piece of it, and it took the shine off the whole morning. Every one of those 411 had given. Nobody had ever given her anything. Bram had, once, and that had opened a door in her, and 400 more had run through her and out again by sunset. She had been a road for 2 months. She had been given exactly one thing that stayed. What would happen if she stopped carrying and started handing out? I had no idea. What does a road do when it stops being a road? Neither did she. And there was nobody left alive who knew anything about spirits above a level 2, because the Corps had never once had a reason to look. Across the water, on the same morning, Corvain stood on the bank at Vessel Ford and watched his own people come back from Ambry, and he had the whole of it from 3 separate mouths before noon. Did he punish them? He did not send one man. He did not close the camps. He had 11,000 hungry civilians on his own roads, and he understood better than anybody alive what happens when you tell hungry people they may not do a kind thing. He sat down instead and did the sum that I had been too tired to do. The boy has to be within a shout. Every single thread in 2 months has gone up inside a shout of him, and he has to know both their names, and the pair have to know each other, or it costs 4 times and it leaks. Does he need a river? Does he need a hill? Neither. He needs to be near people. So take that away from him, said Corvain, and went to look at his maps. He did it on the 19th of the frost, and it took him 1 day and 1 night, and it is the best piece of soldiering I have ever been on the wrong end of. He did not come at us. That is the whole of it, and it took me until the afternoon to understand what was being done. Otto had the horse. Corvain's cavalryman, a dry little article with a permanent squint, and his orders that day were not to fight anybody. 400 riders in loose files went up both banks of the Ashen at dawn and put themselves between my people and every other living soul in that country, and then they simply stayed there, moving when we moved, keeping the gap at half a mile, refusing every fight we offered. Half a mile is nothing to a horse and everything to a voice. By noon we could not get within a shout of a village, a camp, a road party, or a boat. Sarn came down to Clayford to row across and found the far bank held by 40 of Otto's riders who did not shoot at him and did not let him land. Meg Fallow tried the woods track to Ambry with 8 of her people and was turned back twice by men who apologized to her. At 3 in the afternoon I put my last useful thread up, Petch's night eyes into a brindle boy, and after that I had nothing to work with except the 140 people standing around me, and Corvain knew exactly how many that was and exactly what was left in them. How long does 140 last, run round and round? So I did the thing I had spent 2 months telling other people to think hard about, and I did it in a hurry, and I did it to my own. I drained us. I took what the brindle people had and put it where the fighting was. I took from the 4th and put it into the brindle people. I ran it round and round like water in a bucket with a hole in it, and every hand went up and every hand kept going up, because they were mine and I had told them the truth for 2 months and they trusted me. Hescott of Brindle was in the second thing we did that day, on the bridge track at Ninebarrow, and he had already given twice and I took a third from him, his shoulders, and put them in a man of the 4th so that we could get a cart across a broken span before Otto's people closed the road. We got the cart across. Hesk went off the span backwards with a lance through him and the water there is 9 feet deep and moving and we did not get him back. He was younger than me. He had walked 12 miles in the dark to bring me 31 people out of the woods above his own village. Troyale never knew what happened to him. The forge at Brindle was under Corvain's flag by then and there was no way of sending word. That is one. There were 4 more before dark and I remember all of their names and I am not putting them in, because Osakiel taught me what it is to have your name used as an argument. And while I burned my own people in 1s and 2s on a road, Corvain took the Coldgate Reach with his main body against a garrison that had been asking for 2 more companies since the frost. Hollisander held the wall for 11 hours. Then his people at the Watergate opened it, and they opened it because Corvain's men had been talking to them across that water for 3 weeks about how nobody on the far side dies for bread, and because it was true. Van Rusk was in Coldgate when it went. He got out through the Corps house with a mostode in his coat and 11 of Lask's people. Grange's boar died on the stair. Grange never spoke about it and I never asked, and he rode without it for the rest of the war and put his hand down at the height where its shoulder had been for months afterward without noticing he was doing it. By the second dawn Otto's riders had gone. They did not need to be there anymore. Corvain's whole army was across the Ashen and moving up the wet road onto the grain country, and there was nothing between him and Bellwater except 135 exhausted bodies with nothing left in them, and Bellwater's own wall, which is a stone thing built to keep the river out and not an army. I sat on a bank in the morning with my head in my hands and did the sum that Corvain had done 4 days earlier, and it came out the same. He had not beaten the ferry. He had not tried. He had moved the entire war out of earshot. 2 days after that he sent for me. It came under a green branch by a boy called Cull, about Wick's age, who had been given a mouthful to repeat and was terrified of getting it wrong. The commander of the Harrow would speak with the keeper at 9 Barrow Bridge at noon, one of his and one of mine, no arms, and my safety in his own words. Bram said do not go. Dova said go and take a knife in your boot. Grange said something that I have never been able to decide about, which was that Corvain had never once broken his word to anybody about anything, and that this was the frightening part. I went. I took Wick, because Wick could not fight and could not run and could hear better than anybody alive, and because he asked, and because I had stopped being able to refuse him anything after the claybank. The bridge at 9 Barrow was a stone hump over a stream with a broken span and a plank over the break, and Corvain was sitting on the parapet in a farmer's coat with his boots crossed, eating an apple. An old farmer's face. Farmer's hands. Grey stubble. He looked like somebody's uncle who had come to help with a roof. He got the courtesies out of the way in about 4 sentences and did not waste one of them, and then he put the offer on the parapet between us, and it was not what I had spent 2 days preparing for. Bellwater, he said. Your grain city. I will be inside it in 9 days and both of us know it. Its wall is for water and its garrison is old men. When I am inside it, I will not burn it and I will not sack it, because I need what is in it standing up and working, and my country has 11,000 on the roads who are going to eat out of it. Is that an offer, I wanted to know, or a weather report? He agreed with me, and then he made the offer. He would leave Bellwater alone. Not spared for a season. Left, his army would take the outer granaries at Millstone Row, which is half the harvest, and go no further into Calder that year, and every mouth in Bellwater would eat, and every mouth on his roads would eat, and the war on the Ashen would stop where it stood until spring, and in exchange, 10,000 of his own would open their hands to me. I want to be exact about how he put it, because everybody who has told this story since has made him sound like a snake, and he did not sound like a snake. He sounded like a man who had thought it through further than I had. Not conscripts, he said. I do not command that and I would not. I will put it to them the way I put everything to them, and I will tell them what it costs, because you have made it impossible to do it any other way on this river. And I will get 10,000 of them because they have been on short rations since the spring and I am about to hand them a full winter. 10,000 willing hands. What does a man do with that? Everything I had been unable to get since the day Otto's riders put half a mile round me. Enough to make the thing on my arm into something nobody in the world had a word for. And I stood on that bridge with a 14-year-old boy behind me and worked out what he was actually buying, and it took me about a minute, and I have never been so cold in my life. She keeps what she carries. 10,000 of them do not open their hands for a day and go home. To hold 10,000 threads she would have to grow again, and she only grows on what stays, and what he was proposing to put into her, forever, was 10,000 men's worth of what a starving army has in it after a year of losing. She would be the largest thing of her kind that has ever existed on this continent, and she would be made, in her bones, out of Harrow. I put that to him on the bridge and he did not deny one word of it. That is the thing about Corvain. He never once lied to me and it did me more damage than a liar could have managed in 10 years. Whoever holds that creature in 50 years holds my country's inside, he said. Yes. That is what I am buying. I am 50. My country has lost a harvest and a war in the same year, and I have spent both of them buying time with money, and money runs out. This does not. Then he ate the rest of the apple and made it worse. You think I am asking you to poison her? I am asking you to make her ours as well as yours, which is the only reason anybody ever survives being neighbors. And I am offering to buy that with the only thing I have that you want, which is my army's hands, and with the only thing you have that I want, which is a winter where nobody starves. Refuse me and I will still be in Bellwater in 9 days. The difference is only in how many people are alive in the spring on both sides of this river, and you know that, and I know that you know it. I said no. I said it too quickly, and I have gone over that for years, and I still think it was right, and I am not certain, and I do not expect to become certain. Here is what I gave him, standing on the plank over the broken span, and it is the same argument I would make now. I gave him that I had already fed her 9 bad things by my own mouth, from honest volunteers, with good reasons, one at a time, and that I had watched a man walk out of a camp in the dark because of it. I gave him that a creature made out of 10,000 men's despair does not stay a tool. That in 50 years nobody would be holding her. She would be holding whoever came along, and what she would want out of them is whatever she is made of, and I had already seen a hawk-sized version of that look down a line of men like a horse buyer. And I gave him the practical part, which he understood better than the rest of it. You are not buying my fairy, I said. You are buying the thing that decides who in this world is strong tomorrow. And you have spent this whole war proving that anything with a price on it can be bought again by somebody with more money. He sat with that for a while. Then he did the thing that finished the conversation, and it was not anger. He agreed with me. That is a good answer, he said. It is the reply I would want my own son to give. And it will cost about 9,000 people their winter, and you will go into that field with less than you had on the fort at Marrow, and I am still going to be in Bellwater. He got down off the parapet and put out his hand to shake, and I took it, and his palm was flat and open and hard as a board. And both of us noticed it at the same moment, and neither of us said one word about it. Then Wick, who had stood behind me the whole time saying nothing, asked Corvain a question. Is it true that 400 of your men have died since the frost? Everything stopped. Corvain looked at a 14-year-old boy with no wind in his chest for a long moment. Where did you hear that number? From the ones who row across at Clayford. They talk while they are waiting for their hands back. 411 since the frost, and one of them said you promised them nobody would die for bread. I did promise that, Corvain said. And is it still true? He did not reply him. He looked at Wick, and then he looked at me, and I watched something go across that farmer's face that I did not understand for another 3 weeks, and then he turned round and walked back down the 9-barrow road to his own people. Wick was grey and sweating by the time we got back to our own line, because it is 4 miles and he could not do 4 miles anymore, and he would not be carried where anybody could see. He apologized to me for asking it. He thought he had spoiled something. I have thought about that walk back more than about anything else in the war. Because a boy who had given me his wind on a clay bank had just done the only piece of damage anybody did to Corvain in 3 months. He had done it with a number he picked up off men waiting for their hands back. And he was sorry about it. There is one more thing in that number, and I did not get to it until we were most of the way home. 411 is what we ran at Ambry. Wick kept that tally himself, on his knees in a wet field, with a stub of pencil and no wind in his chest, until he could not stand up. So he had the same number in his head twice, one of them made out of open hands and the other out of dead men, and he had walked across a bridge under a green branch and put the second one in front of the man who owned it. I have never once put it to him. There was no putting it to him after the fish market, and it did not occur to me before it, and at this distance the question would be an insult to a man of 20 who has been carrying my words for 6 years. It took us 3 days to go the 30 miles from 9-barrow to Bellwater, and I have never been so tired in my life, and the 3 days are worth putting down, because they are the only stretch of that whole autumn where I found out what the price had actually bought. We went down the wet road with 135 people, no bread, no orders, and Oddle's riders on both flanks keeping their half-mile and never once closing. At Harncross the elders shut the gate on us. I do not blame them. Corvain's criers had been through 2 days before with the terms and the list of towns, and a man named Red Oler stood on the wall of his own mill and told Dovamarsh, politely, that Harncross had a winter of flour and no wish to be a battlefield. Would you feed the children? Dova wanted to know. He fed the children. He would not open the gate, and he fed 40 children over the wall in baskets, and he stood there while it was done, and he did not look at me once. At Wynn they came out to us, the whole village, in the rain, on the road, with what they had. Simtari, who kept the crossroads inn, put 9 sacks of oats on a cart and walked them a mile down the road so that we would not have to come inside his fence, because coming inside his fence would have been the thing Corvain's people asked about afterwards. And a girl of about 16 called Isla Pen came out with the oats and did not go back with the cart. She had heard the story about the boy who says the price first. She had heard it in a version with about 4 wrong things in it. She had walked out of a village that had decided to be careful, in the rain, with a blanket and a knife, and she stood in front of me on the wet road and put her hand out flat with the palm up, and she wanted to know what it cost. I told her the truth, and I told her the worst version of it, because I was tired and because I had stopped being able to make it sound like anything, and I named Ezekiel and Bramodel and Wick and the man of the fourth who had walked out of a camp in the dark. She listened to all of it standing in the rain, and then she asked whether there was anything else I wanted to add. There was not. Then take my legs, she said. I can walk anybody in this village into the ground, and there is nothing else in me that is worth a thing to anybody. I did not take them. Not that day and not for 9 days after. What I did was let her walk with us, and by Bellwater she knew every name in that 135, and she is the one who carried Bramodel's hook up the wall stair on the morning of the thaw because his hands had gone. At Old Bridge we found the road full of Calder's own. 300 people out of the Coldgate Reach with handcarts, going the same way we were, because Corvain's terms are good and being inside them is still being inside somebody else's country. Parengost, who had been the grain warden at Coldgate and had walked out of it when the water gate opened, had them roughly in hand and had been walking for 4 days. He knew who I was. Everybody on that road knew who I was by then, and the version they had was the one where a boy on a wall had cost a woman her hands, and it had got round faster than the other one. He came and found me at the fire and put it to me straight, and he had 400 and some people behind him and a right to ask. Is it true that you take it out of your own? Yes. And that they do not get all of it back? Yes. Then why is anybody still opening a hand for you? That is the question, and I could not answer it, and I have thought about it since and I still cannot, and the honest position is that it was never mine to answer. Dovelmarsh answered it, out of the dark on the other side of the fire, and she did it in about a dozen words, and I am not going to clean them up. Because the other lot never even tell you there is a price, and that is how you know what they think of you. Parengost stood there for a while. Then he went back to his people and they walked with us to Bellwater, and about 80 of them opened a hand for me before the spring, and 7 of them are dead. At Saltmore, on the second day, Ottle's riders got closer than half a mile for the first time. I thought it was a fight. It was not. A man came in on his own with his hands where we could see them and his helmet off, and he asked for the keeper, and Bram brought him to me with 2 people on either side of him and everybody expecting the worst. His name was Joss. He was one of Ottle's. He had been screening us for 6 days, and he was carrying a thing he had been carrying since Clayford and could not get rid of. Are you the one that says the price first? Yes. Then here, and he put his hand out flat in the middle of a road with a dozen riders on the ridge behind him watching, and gave me the thing that had been keeping him awake since a boat went over at the cattle stair with 4 of his own on it, and went back up the ridge, and got back on his horse, and went on screening us for another day and a half. What do you do with that one? I have never known. He was doing his job. His job was to keep me away from people, and he was doing it well, and he was the reason Hesk went into 9 feet of water on a broken span. And in the middle of doing it he came down off a ridge and opened his hand because there was nowhere else on that road to put the thing he was carrying. I have it from Vest that Ottle knew and said nothing. We came into Bellwater on the 26th by the north road with the river house on our left under the wall, and I had not been inside that gate in 3 years. Although Creel had the east gate and had been keeping it for 19 years and had 6 old men and a chain. Hanavoy had the fish market and the water companies and a daughter called Aneth who was 15 and had already worked out that the men on the wall were going to need somebody to carry water and had organized 9 girls to do it. Parengost took over the row, with a wheelwright named Estendry behind him, because he had run a grain reach for 14 years and Bellwater's own grain warden had gone to the capital in the autumn and had not come back. And Nan Ivory came down the ropewalk lane in the rain with 400 children behind her in a line and asked me, in front of my own people, whether the city was going to hold. Wick had to answer her, because I could still talk then and I could not get anything out. None of those 5 people had a rank. Not one of them had an order from anybody. Bellwater's own commander of the river guard was an old man who had spent the last 3 days trying to get an answer out of the capital and had stopped trying by the time we arrived. That is what was defending 40,000 mouths and the grain of a whole country. A gatekeeper with a chain. A water woman with 9 girls. A grain man off a road. An old woman with a building full of orphans, and 135 people who had walked 30 miles being screened by cavalry, with nothing left in them, following a boy who could still speak and had nothing left to say. Bellwater is a grain city with a river wall, 7 bridges, 40,000 mouths and no garrison worth the word. I grew up in it. The river house they call the Low House is on the north side under the wall where the mud is worst, and Nan Ivory ran it for 30 years and was running it still. And she is the reason I know how to read. And she had 400 children in that building the week Corvain came up the wet road. We got inside on the 26th, ahead of him, with the whole of what we had. 135 people off the wet road, 40 of them the 4th. Fenrusk with 11 of Lasks and a Mostoad. Grange with no bore. Sarn and 6 Harrow men who had rowed across for the last time and stayed on our side, which cost them everything they had at home and which nobody made them do. And Marin Lask, who came out of a room at Bellwater on the second day with her rank gone and 4 months of nothing behind her, and walked up the wall and stood next to Bram O'Dell and asked what needed doing. Against that, on the flat ground east of the city, Corvain put 9,000, and he did it in the open over 3 days without hurrying, because there was nothing we could do to stop him doing it. How much was left in us? It had a bottom, and I could see the bottom from the top of the wall. Asa Keel had nothing. Bram had given his quiet for good and had a flinch. Wick had 2/3 of a boy's wind. The Brindle people had been run round and round like water in a bucket for a day and a night on the wet road, and most of them were down to the last thin version of whatever they had. You cannot rest that. There is no line in the rule about rest. What comes back at sunset comes back, and what is worn down stays worn down, and 11 weeks of hard use was standing on that wall in the shape of about 150 tired bodies. Nan Ivory came up the wall stair on the second evening with a pot of something and found me sitting with my back to the parapet and a hawk-sized creature asleep on my knee. She had known me since I was 4 days old. She looked at Nettle for a long time. Is that the level one? That is the level one. She sat down on the step and gave me the soup and let me know that the Corps had come round the river house in my second year and told the children what the rings measured, and that she had never once believed a word of it, and that she had one question and I was to answer it honestly. Can you save this city with that? Can you save any of it? And I gave her the honest answer, which was no. Not with 150 tired people, not against 9,000. Not on threads, not with everything I had, not if I stood on that wall and worked until my voice went and every single person inside Bellwater opened their hand at once, because that was the arithmetic, and I had been doing arithmetic since the far bank at Marrow Ford, and this was the first time it had come out with nothing on my side of it at all. He came at the east side on the first morning of the thaw, and the first 3 hours of it went exactly the way the arithmetic said they would. Bellwater's east wall runs from the Millstone Row granaries down to the water stair, and it is chest high in places because it was built against the river and not against anybody's army, and the whole of my strength was standing on top of it. I got 14 threads up in the first hour and I felt every one of them go thin under my hand like wet rope. Meg Fallow gave and I put it into a boy of the 4th on the granary steps and it leaked out of him inside 20 minutes. Sarn gave and it held better and still went before noon. Petch and Wold, who had rowed across for the last time in the autumn and had not been home since, gave 4 times between them and the 4th one barely lit. Because they were worn. All of them. 11 weeks of me. Corvain put his engines on the row and started dropping stone into the granary roofs, and while he was doing it he sent criers along the whole length of that wall under green branches, and the criers were not shouting threats, they were shouting terms. In detail. What Bellwater would keep, what would be taken, who would be fed, and the name of every town on the Ashen that had gone over and had not been burned, in order, at volume, all morning. He was working my wall the way he had worked Brindle's Square, and I could not answer him with a single thread, because a thread does not make a frightened man stop wondering whether the other side is better. Bram O'Dell held the east gate. I want to put down what that cost, because he had given his quiet away in a field and it never came back and everybody knew it. Every time the engines dropped a stone into the row, Bram came off the ground. It happened perhaps 40 times that morning. His hands went so badly by the 3rd hour that he could not hold a hook, and he tucked them under his arms and went on standing where the company could see him, and the 9th held the gate because 11 years of habit is a real thing even when the man it grew on is finished. Marin Lask ran the granary roofs with 60 Bellwater carters, throwing wet sacking on fires with no rank, no company, and 4 months of a core room behind her. Grange fought on the water stair with a spear and no spirit at all. Somebody should say that. A man who had spent 6 years telling everybody that the ring measures the man stood in a river gate for 2 hours with nothing but a spear. Van Rusk sat behind the granary wall with his moss-toad and worked out where the engine stones were falling, and he was right about it 4 times. And Nan Ivory moved the river house children twice on his word and got all 400 of them across to the west side before the row went up, and I stood on the wall in the middle of all of it and put up thin threads that would not hold, and by noon I was doing arithmetic on people the way a man tallies coins in the dark. Asa Keel came up the wall stair at about that time. She had spent the morning running water and shifting wounded, and she had a face on her that I had seen once before, on a gravel bank at Marrow when she worked out what her nephew was standing in. She stood in front of me and she gave me my own sentence, in the right order, the way she had heard me say it 1,000 times. Asa Keel. My nerve. To whoever needs it. I had not used her name since the wall at Coldgate. I used it then. Nettle came off my arm, and went to her, and hung over her open hand, and would not take. Not because of any rule. There was nothing there. Whatever it is in a person that steadies a hand had been carried out of that woman thread by thread from the second night at Marrow Ford to the wet road. And what was left in her that morning was courage, which she had in more quantity than anybody I have known, and courage is not a thing you can hand over. Asakeel stood there with her hand open in front of a creature that would not touch it, and then she closed it, and went back down the stair to carry water. Wick came up 10 minutes later and I did not even let him get the sentence out. Then the row went 2 roofs at once, then the third, and a whole year of Calder's harvest went up in a column you could see from 4 miles down the river, and Corvain's people came over the low wall on either side of the granary gate while the whole east side was watching the smoke. We lost the east gate at about 1 in the afternoon. Bram brought what was left of the 9th back to the second wall by the fish market, and he did it without running, and it is the last piece of soldiering he ever did. And that was the bottom. I sat down on a fish crate with my back against a wall while people ran past me in both directions, and I had a hawk-sized creature on my arm and nothing to put in her and nobody left to take it from, and I understood at last that I had spent 11 weeks being a road. Everything I had ever done had gone through me from one person to another. I had never once made anything. I had moved what other people had, and taken my cut in the shape of a thing that got heavier, and now there was nothing left on the whole east side of Bellwater to move. So I put it to her. Not out of any cleverness. I was empty and beaten and sitting on a fish crate, and I looked at the thing on my arm that I had fed all autumn and that had never once been asked a question in her life, and I said the only sentence I had left: "What have you got?" She looked at me. And then she showed me, and I have no words for how she did it, and neither has anybody else who was near enough to see. What I can put down is what was in it. Asakeel's hands. Not the memory of them. The thing itself, the steadiness that had been carried out of that woman a thread at a time and had gone back to her a little smaller every sunset. All the missing pieces were in there. Every shaving of it, kept. Bram O'Dell's quiet, whole, sitting in her like a stone in a well. Wick's wind. A widow's 14 sleepless months. Meg Fallow's steadiness. Neve Sallow's afternoon on a haystack. Cass Ober's 30 years of not being afraid of a height. Holder's thing that did not stop at a door, 9 times over, and I saw those too when she did not hide them from me. 411 hands worth of patience out of a wet field at Ambry. Every thread since the second night at Marrow Ford, 9,000 of them and more. She had carried every one and kept a trace of every one, and none of it, not one grain, had ever come back out of her, because nobody had ever once thought to ask a road what it was carrying. And the rule was sitting there in front of me the way it had been sitting there since the chalk, and I had gone over it 1,000 times and never once followed it to the end. She takes from a hand that opens. She puts it in whoever is named. There is nothing in it about the hand belonging to somebody else. She had never opened hers. She had never been able to. For 11 weeks she had gone where a boy's voice sent her, taken what a boy's voice named, and put it where a boy's voice pointed, and the whole of her had been a road because I had been standing on one end of it doing the talking. To give what she had to be the giver. To be the giver she had to open her own hand. And she could not do that while she moved on my say-so, because a hand that opens on somebody else's word is not open, and she has never once in her life been fooled about which is which. I had to stop being the one who names. I want to be honest about what came after, because people have made it into something noble and it was not noble, it was arithmetic done fast by a frightened boy on a fish crate. I could not name 10,000 people in one breath. Nobody could. Whatever this was going to be, it was not going to run through my mouth, and my mouth was the only part of the whole business that had ever been mine. I had thought it was mine, at any rate. The calling gives you what climbs out of the ring, and I had spent the whole autumn thinking that what I got was a fairy, and I had that backwards. What I got was the naming. She was somebody in her own right the entire time and I had been standing in front of her doing all the talking. Wick found me on the crate. He had been looking for me since the gate went. He worked out what I was going to do from about 6 words, because he was Wick, and he had no wind to argue with and he argued anyway. You cannot. It has no sunset. Bram never got his back and you know that better than anybody. I know. Then how do you ask? How does anybody ask you for anything ever again? They will not ask me. That is the whole of it. He stood in front of me and cried, which he had not done at the clay bank or on the wall at Coldgate or when the wind went, and then he got out of my way, because he had been the one who worked out that she had never been given anything, and he had known where that led for longer than I had. Bram O'Dell came down the fish market with his hands under his arms and looked at the two of us and did not ask a single question. He had given his in a field for the arithmetic and he recognized the look, and all he did was stand where I could see him, the way he had stood in the middle of a mill yard on the morning his son lost an arm. I got up off the crate. I had a creature the size of a hunting hawk on my forearm with her wings shut, and behind me the east side of Bellwater was burning, and I said the last sentence I have ever said with my own mouth. Dane Farrow. My voice. To her. And I opened my hand. She came off my arm and landed in my palm the way she had landed on the chalk on the first morning, the size of my thumb and then not, and she took it. There was no green line. There was no light going anywhere. It went out of the middle of me and it did not stop, the way Bram's had not stopped, and there was a moment about halfway through where I understood exactly what I had spent and would have taken it back if there had been any way to. Then it was gone and my mouth was full of nothing and my throat was a piece of rope, and I have not spoken one word since, and I was 19 years old. The last thing I ever said was her name in a sentence, in the right order, the way I said it 1,000 times, and she got heavy in my hand. I went down on my knees on the fish market cobbles with her weight, and she came off my palm on her own, without being sent, for the first time in her life, and went up about the height of a roof and stopped there. And opened her hand. What came out of her did not look like a thread. A thread is a line about as thick as string that goes from one open palm to one named person and lasts until the sun goes down. Everybody on the Ashen had seen 1,000 of them by that spring and nobody was frightened of them anymore. This came off her in every direction at once, low and slow, about the height of a roof, and it went over the fish market and down the lanes and out along the top of the second wall like water finding the shape of a floor. It was the same green. That is the thing I keep coming back to. It was the same color as the first one that went out of Osakiel's hand into a boy's wrists on a gravel bank, and there was no more magic in it than there had been in that one, and it was made out of exactly the same stuff, which is people who had opened their hands. The difference was the direction. Osakiel was on the water stair with 2 buckets when it reached her. She has never described what it felt like and I have stopped asking. What people saw was a woman drop 2 full buckets on stone, and stand there with her hands out in front of her, turning them over, and then close them into fists and open them again about 6 times. Everything the erosion had taken off that woman since the second night at Marrow Ford came back at once. Not the loan. The loan had always come back at sunset. The shavings. 11 weeks of them, a little every dusk, all of it kept, all of it in one go. She went up the fish market stair, took the bow off the man of the 4th she had given it to, and put 3 into the granary gate at 80 paces in the time it takes to breathe out. 80 paces. She had never made that shot in her life. Nobody had, because it was not only her own back. There was 2 months of a road in that creature, and roads collect, and what came off her had weight in it that had never belonged to anybody in particular. Wick was on the second wall. He got his wind back standing still, and then he got more than his wind, and the first thing that boy did with a whole chest for the first time since the clay bank was run the length of the second wall shouting one sentence at everybody he passed. Open your hands, all of you. Open your hands. That is how it went out across Bellwater, and it did not go out because I sent it, because I could not send anything ever again. It went out because a 14-year-old with new lungs ran along a wall shouting at people, and behind him Meg Fallow started doing the same down the lanes. And Dova Marsh went through the fish market taking hold of men's wrists and pulling their fingers open with language that got the job done. They did it. I still have trouble with that. 6 years on, 40,000 frightened civilians in what was left of 2 companies, in the middle of a burning city, put their hands up and opened them, because for 11 weeks a boy had been standing on walls telling them exactly what it cost. And she gave it to them. I have been asked 100 times what she gave. It is the wrong question and it took me a year to find the right one, and the right one is who she gave it to. Everybody who had ever given anything got their own back, all of it, every shaving, and Bellwater was full of those people because I had been running that city's neighbors dry since the frost. And everybody standing next to them got the surplus, because a source does not measure, and there was 2 months of surplus in her, and it went where the hands were. The 4th on the second wall went up like a struck match. Marin Lask's carters on the granary roof stopped being carters. Finn Rusk, who pulled a level 2 and had spent 4 years being nothing, went over the fish market wall with the Bellwater men and did not come back down for an hour. Bram O'Dell's hands stopped shaking. That was all it did for him, and it did not last, and both of us knew what it meant before the hour was out. His quiet did not come back. It never has. He had given that with no sunset on it, into her, for good, and what is given to her is what she is made of and does not come out again, and the same is true of my voice, and both of us knew the rule better than anybody alive because we had each paid it once. What he got was what the erosion had taken from him afterwards, in ones and twos, across a whole autumn of a war he was too old for. It was enough to get him through that afternoon. He stood in the east gate with a hook in his hands and did not flinch at a single stone, and I watched him from the fish market and could not say one word to him about it. Grange took the water stair back with 9 men and a spear and no spirit of any kind. He had never given me anything. Not once in the whole war. He had ridden after us on the 11th of the frost with no orders, and he had fought at Bellwater with a spear because there was fighting to do, and when it came over the wall he was standing next to Sarn with his hands at his side. Sarn reached over and pulled his fingers open for him. That is a small thing, and I put it in because Grange has never mentioned it in 6 years, and because a Harrow bridge guard opening a corpsman's fist in the middle of Bellwater is the whole of what that afternoon was. We had the east gate back before 3. I want to be careful here, because this is where the story usually gets told as a miracle, and it was a fight. Lask's carters lost the north granary anyway, and it burned to the ground with the harvest in it. Mab Trill, who had driven a Bellwater grain wagon for 19 years and had opened her hand on the wall like everybody else, went down in the lane behind the row with a spear in her and did not get up. 7 of Meg Fallows Brindle people died in that hour, and 4 of them were people who had walked out of a village with nothing rather than be sold. What we had was not invulnerability. What we had was 4,000 people who were suddenly the best version of themselves that had ever existed, against 9,000 who were exactly what they had been at breakfast, and that is enough to turn a street, and it is not enough to make anybody safe. The other thing that happened in that quarter of an hour has been told worse than any part of this, so I will keep it short and put in only what I saw myself. Every spirit inside Bellwater's wall came to the fish market. Nobody called them. They came off shoulders and out of packs and down off the roofs of Coyle Street, a greyhound thing belonging to a corpsman who was already dead on the row, 2 small ones out of the rope walk that had never been worth a name, and Fenrusk's moss toad, which went the whole length of that market on its own legs like something keeping an appointment. None of them did anything, and that is what gets left out when it is told. They did not fight and they did not carry, and not one of them was the slightest use to anybody that afternoon. They got as close to her as the crowd would let them, and they stopped there. And they were still there at dark. Ilo Grange was on the water stair when the last of them went past his boots. He had spent 6 years telling anybody who would stand still what a chalk ring measures. He said one word out loud. A Bellwater man beside him heard it and brought it to me that evening, because by then nothing could reach me unless somebody carried it, and the word was Queen. Grange has never said it again in 6 years, and he has never taken it back either. What they wanted I have had 6 years to work out, and the best I have got is this. She had carried a piece of 9,000 people through the middle of her and had given none of it back. Things like her can feel a weight of that kind from the other side of a city. They were not obeying her, and they never have. They had come to see what she was going to do with all of it, and that is the same thing I was down on those cobbles waiting for. And then it went over the river. Nobody planned it. I could not have planned it if I had wanted to, and I want that on the record, because Corvain thought for about a day that I had. She was a source now, and she did not have a side, because nobody had ever given her one. What she had was a list of everybody who had opened a hand to her since the second night at Marrow Ford, and there was no flag written next to any of those names, and there never had been. Patch and Wold were with us, so we're back in the 6 who had rode across for the last time in the autumn and stayed. They got theirs, and the men beside them got the surplus, and none of that surprised anybody. But the 9 who had rode back, and Halder, who had given up the thing that did not stop at a door 9 times, and gone home to sleep. And every one of the 11,000 from the roads who had opened a hand in a wet field at Ambry and got nothing out of it except a night without their patients. They were on the other side of that field, or on the roads behind it, or in the camps at Vessel Ford, and it went to them exactly the same, because she had taken from them exactly the same. Sela was in Corvain's camp when it reached her. She had come across with the carts 3 days before because the army had the grain, and the grain was where the children were. She had been given back 411 hands worth of a wet field, and she stood up in the middle of a Harrow supply line with the green on her and started telling everybody within reach where it had come from. Halder was in the 3rd rank on the flat ground east of the row. He got his back the same as everybody, and what he had given had been the worst thing in him, and I have thought about what that hour was like for him more than I have thought about most of the people I killed. But he also got the surplus, the way everybody standing near a giver got the surplus, and I have it from 3 people who were near him that a big man in the 3rd rank of Corvain's center went down on his knees in the mud with his hands over his face and would not get up and would not be moved. The Harrow center stopped. It did not break. I want to be exact, because their people have had to live with the way this gets told, and they did not run. Green went across their front rank from our side, into men who had given something to a boy across a river in the autumn and had rode home before light and never told anybody about it. And it did not hurt anybody, and it did not compel anybody, and every man in that line understood in the same 3 seconds where it had come from and what it meant. You cannot press an attack while the enemy is handing your own back to you in front of your friends. There is no drill for it. Otto could not get his horse to move up the flank, and it was not the horses. And into the middle of that came the number. Wick had put it on the 9-barrow bridge with a green branch over his head, and Corvain had not answered him, and it had gone across that river the way things go, from rowers waiting for their hands back, and it had been going round the harrow camps for 3 weeks. 411 since the frost. Then 640 at Coldgate and the Row. A man on that field could work out for himself that the thing he had been promised in the spring had stopped being true some time around the first frost, and nobody had come and told him, and now the other side had just given him back a thing out of his own chest for nothing. Corvain rode down to his own centre at about 4 in the afternoon. I was not there, and I will not invent it. What I have is from Sela on, who was 40 paces away with a cart, and from Halder, who was on his knees in the mud, and from a file leader named Vess who told it to Sarn a month later on a boat. He did not shout at them. He sat his horse in front of a stopped army and looked at it for a while. Then he asked one question, and Vess says he asked it quietly, and that everybody within 30 paces heard it because there was no other sound on that field. Whose is that? Did anybody answer him? Not one man. Halder was on his knees. Sela on had her hands full of a child. Vess says the man next to him had his palm still open and was looking at it. And Corvain, who had taken 14 towns without a siege by putting the true price in front of people and letting them choose, sat on a horse in front of 9,000 men and understood that somebody had just outbid him with something he could not print, borrow, or take out of a granary. He turned his horse and gave the order to disengage, and it went down that field in about 4 minutes, and Otto's horse covered the withdrawal, and by dark there was nobody on the flat ground east of Bellwater except our people and the dead. He had not lost the battle. He was never going to lose that battle. He had 9,000 men and a broken wall in front of him, and until 3 in the afternoon he had been winning it comfortably. What he had lost was the ability to spend the next hour without breaking the only promise he had ever made to his own country in public. Nobody dies for bread. He had held that for a year with money, and then with buying, and then with a river, and it had gone quietly on him sometime in the autumn, and everybody on that field had just been handed proof of it by the enemy, in the form of a gift. Vess told Sarn that it was the first order Corvain ever gave that nobody argued about. The war did not end that afternoon. Nothing ends on the day of the fight. What ended was the thing Corvain had been buying with, and after that everybody on the Ashen had to work out what to use instead, and it took the rest of the spring, and it was mostly done by people whose names were not in anybody's orders. The first night was the worst night of my life, and I could not say one word during any of it. The North Granary burned until dawn and took Mab Trill's Lane and the whole of Coyle Street with it. The Bellwater water companies worked the fish market pumps until the leather split, and Nan Ivory had 400 Riverhouse children in the Ropewalk Chapel on the west side and no way of knowing whether her own building was still standing. I walked through it with a creature the size of a hunting hawk on my shoulder and a throat full of rope, and every second person who saw me wanted a reply to something, and I had nothing to give any of them. Wick took it off me at about midnight in the fish market without being asked. He came and stood next to me while a Bellwater man named Fenner Coyle shouted at me about his brother, and he waited until the man had finished, and then he said the thing I would have said. He cannot answer you. He gave his voice to her this afternoon and it does not come back. If you want to know about your brother, go to Marin Lask at the water stair, she has the names. Fenner Coyle looked at the two of us for a while and then went to the water stair. That is how it worked from then on, and we never discussed it once. Wick had spent 2 months learning what I was going to say before I said it, because that is what a boy does when the only thing he owns is his usefulness, and now that skill was the reason a city could talk to me, I have thought a great deal about the shape of that. I took a 14-year-old boy's wind out of his chest on a claybank and gave him nothing back for 2 months, and then a creature I had built out of other people handed him his lungs and more, and the first use he put them to was carrying my words for me. Has he ever once made me feel it? That is Wick, and the answer is no. The Harrow army sat on the flat ground east of the Row for 4 days and did not attack and did not leave. I have been told since that this was the most dangerous 4 days of the whole war, and I believe it. 9,000 men who had stopped fighting for a reason nobody in any manual had ever written down, 4 miles from a burned granary, with their own supply in the camps at Vessel Ford and 11,000 civilians on the roads behind them and a spring that had not come yet. Corvain held it together, and I do not know how, and neither does Vess, who was standing in it. What broke the 4 days was not a commander. It was Ceylon walking out of the Harrow supply line on the second morning with Bet Croy and about 60 women from Ambry and the Salt Road, and coming up the Bellwater East Road under no branch and no flag, and asking at the broken gate for the woman with the children. Nan Ivory came down to the gate. I was there for that, and I could not say anything, and it was the best place I have ever been unable to speak. Ceylon told her that 411 of her people had opened their hands in a wet field at Ambry for a boy who had told them the truth first, and that 2 days ago the thing on his shoulder had given it back to every one of them and to their neighbors as well, in the middle of somebody else's battle, without being asked, and that there were 11,000 of them on the roads with nothing, and that Bellwater had a harvest, and that she had not come to beg and she was not going to. She had come to find out what her people could do for the grain. Nan Ivory had run a building of orphans for 30 years on other people's leftovers. I have never seen anybody understand a proposition faster. By the end of that week there were 900 Harrow civilians inside Bellwater's east wall rebuilding the row with the city's own carters, and being paid in grain by the sack at the end of every day. And the arrangement was made by 2 women at a broken gate with nobody's authority at all, and it has never been written into anything since. Corvain's army watched that happen from 4 miles away, and it took the last of the ground out from under him. He came in on the 6th day with Otto and Vess and 20 riders and no branch, and he asked to see me, and by then everybody in that city knew that seeing me meant seeing a boy of 14 with new lungs standing at my shoulder. We met in the fish market because the wall was down and the rope walk was full of children. He looked older than he had at 9 Barrow. Farmer's hands, and he had spent 4 days holding an army together with nothing. He talked and Wick talked back for me, and I sat there and did what I have done ever since, which is listen and put my hand on Wick's arm when he has got it wrong. Corvain wanted 3 things and he named them in order, the way he named everything. He wanted grain for the roads, and he had already worked out that he was not going to get it from an army and that Ceylon had got it from a woman at a gate in half an hour. He wanted his people home. All of them, the 11,000 and the 9,000, before the ground got hard again. And he wanted to know what I was going to do with her. Wick asked him why he thought that was any of his business, which is not what I would have said, and which was better than what I would have said. Corvain answered him without any heat at all. He said that a thing which can take the worst out of 9,000 men and hand it back to them across a battlefield is going to be somebody's business for the next 200 years, and that he would rather find out now, from the boy who had refused to sell her to him, than in 20 years from whoever ends up holding her. Then he asked the question I had been unable to answer since the fish crate, and Wick could not answer it either, and both of us sat there in front of him with nothing. Who names her now? The truth is that nobody does. That is what I bought with my voice, and I did not entirely understand what I was buying at the time. She does not answer to me. She has not answered to anybody since the fish market, and she does not belong to Calder or to the Corps or to the Ninth or to me, and there is nothing anybody can do about that, because the only lever that ever moved her was a boy's voice, and that boy handed it over. What she does is this, and it has not changed in 6 years. People come and stand where she is and open their hands, and say what they want, out of their own mouths, in their own words, and she decides. She still will not take from a shut hand. She has never once been fooled about the difference, and I have watched a great many people try. She still cannot carry a thing that is not in a person, or a thing that lives in the head, and she still gives back at sunset, and she still keeps a trace of everything, and everything given to her with no sunset on it stays. And she is a source now, and she gives out of what she has, and what she has is 9,000 threads worth of a war and 411 hands out of a wet field and a widow's 14 sleepless months and an old man's quiet and a boy's voice. Which means that the reply to Corvain's question, if anybody wants it, is that she was named by everybody who ever opened a hand in front of her, and she is made out of them, and that is who she answers to. He sat with that for a while in the fish market. Then he said the last thing he ever said to me, and it was not about the war. You are 19 and you have no voice and no rank and nothing to leave anybody, and you have made the only thing on this continent that cannot be bought. I have spent 30 years learning the price of things. I would like it noted that I know exactly what I am looking at. Then he stood up and went out to arrange the roads. The terms were settled over 3 weeks by people who had no business settling anything. Marin Lask had no rank and did the crossings. Ceylon and Nan Ivory did the grain and did not once let a soldier into the room. Meg Fallow and Gant, the same quartermaster who had stood by the wagons at Brindle, worked out the carts with a Vessel Ford woman called Des. Sarn and his cousins Petch and Wool did the boats at Clayford, which was the easiest part of the whole business because they had been doing it in the dark for 3 months anyway. Grange rode to Almsford and made the case to the chalk house, in front of a man called Vanter who had chalked rings for 20 years, and I have it from 4 people that he made it badly, angrily, and at enormous length, and that he was thrown out twice and came back both times. What he got in the end was not what he wanted. It never is. He wanted the callings ended. What he got was a rule that a spirit is a person's for life and cannot be moved by anybody, and a second rule that the Corps no longer records a level, and a third that nobody under the age of 16 may stand in a chalk ring at all. That last one was his, entirely, and he put it in because of Wick, and Wick has never forgiven him for it and rides him about it every time they are in the same room. Van Rusk went back to the Corps with Grange and runs the Bellwater office now, and the office has one job, which is to go and find out what people's spirits actually do rather than what rank they came out at. He has 1,100 entries. About 40 of them can do something nobody expected. There is a level 1 in Ambry, an ash-colored thing belonging to a girl called Taberso, that can tell you whether a wall is going to fall down, and it took the Corps 6 years to find her. Marin Lask was offered her place back in the spring and did not take it. She runs the Coldgate crossings now for the 2 countries together, which is a thing that did not exist before that year and had to be invented, and she is the only person alive who can make Ottle and Grange sit at the same table without it going badly. Hollisander died at Coldgate on the day the Watergate opened, and I have left that to this point because it took me 2 years to be able to put it down. He held that wall 11 hours with old men. I saw him twice in my life, and he gave me a day when he had 6 hours to give. Tor Yale came to Bellwater in the autumn. He came 30 miles on a cart from a village that had spent a year under Corvain's flag and was now under nobody's, and he came to find out what had happened to his apprentice, because no word had ever reached the forge. Wick told him. I stood there. He wanted the whole of it, including the 3rd thread, and Wick gave him the whole of it, including that I had taken Hesk's shoulders after he had already given twice that day, and that the cart got across the broken span and Hesk did not. Tor Yale sat on the edge of that cart in the fish market for a long time. Then he asked whether there had been a choice, and Wick said that there had been, and that it was mine, and that I had made it in a hurry with Ottle's horse on the road. He nodded. He did not shout at me, and he did not forgive me either. And I have come to understand that those are the 2 things you get from people who have lost somebody and are being honest. What he did was stay. He put a forge up on the east side inside the year and took 4 of Meg Fallows Brindle people into it as apprentices, and one of them is a girl called Jory who was carrying Meg's pot on the road the day they came up to Coldgate, and she will have that forge in 10 years. Neve Sallow came down from Sallow Mill in the summer with 2 cows and a mother-in-law and a cart, because the Rylands had gone sour with the flooding and never came back right. Dova Marsh met her at the gate. Those 2 had not seen each other since the morning of the hay. Dova has the yard behind the rope walk now, and it is hers, on paper, with her name on it, which was the only thing that woman ever wanted out of any of this, and she never once asked me for it. Nan Ivory arranged it in about 4 minutes and would not discuss it afterwards. Neve Sallow lives in the room above. The 2 of them run the West Side Water, and the pair of them together are more frightening than Ottle's whole cavalry. Cass Ober came back in the 2nd spring. She had walked 8 miles to give me her balance in the autumn and had walked home again when I told the 4th the truth, and she had been on that barn roof ever since, and she was past 70. She came into the fish market and found me and let me know that she had felt something come back into her hands on a roof 8 miles away on an afternoon in the thaw and had known immediately where it had come from and had spent 2 years being angry about it. Then she asked what had happened to my voice. Wick told her. She sat down next to me on the crate and did not say anything for a while, and then she said that her son had gone into Coldgate at 17 and had come out at nothing, and that she had spent 30 years learning not to be afraid of a height and had given it to a boy she did not know because of that, and that if I ever needed it again she was in the same barn. We have never found Doyle Frayne. Meg Fallow saw him on the 9-Barrow Road on the night he walked out of the camp and called after him, and he did not stop. There have been 3 men since who somebody thought was him, and none of them were. I put his name in here because Halder is alive, and sleeps, and has a farm at Farron with his brother, and got his own thing back on a battlefield and got given a great deal more besides, and every part of that is right and I am glad of it. And a man from the 4th who opened his hand for me on a good morning after 5 weeks of thinking about it, because I had told him the truth for 5 weeks, is somewhere on a road, or in a river, or under a hedge. That is the arithmetic. I did it once on a gravel bank at Marrow Ford with 11 boys behind me, and I have been doing it ever since, and it does not stop coming out. Osakiel kept the bow for 12 days after the thaw and then gave it away again. She had it back off the man of the 4th in the middle of the fight, and she put 3 into the granary gate at 80 paces, and for those 12 days she was better than she had ever been in her life, because 2 months of a road had gone into her along with her own. Then she walked across the fish market and gave it to a bellwater girl called Anethvoy who had been on the second wall with a borrowed bow and no idea what she was doing and had hit 2 men anyway. Why? Wick asked her that in front of me. He asks people things I would not. Because I have had it since I was 15 and it is the only thing anybody has ever wanted off me, Asa said. And because I have found out what I am like without it, and I would rather find out what I am like with something else. She runs the water for the whole east side now with Neve Sallow. She teaches Anethvoy on Sundays and is unbearable about it. Bram O'Dell went home in the summer. He had 11 years in the ninth and a son with one arm and a flinch that does not go, and there was no company any more for him to be the quiet man of, because the ninth had stopped being a company on the 10th of the frost and never started again. Pell has the farm at Rowan Hatch and does the work of a pair with one arm and a lot of complaining. Bram sits in the yard and comes off the bench when a gate bangs. I go out there twice a year. He talks and I do not, which suits both of us better than it should. He has never once asked me whether it was worth his quiet, and I have never been able to ask him anything at all, and the two of us sit in that yard being the only people alive who know exactly what the other one paid. Tam and Orrin Rill went back to Brindle and took the pond off the elders, with a wing girl called Peg Murley doing the tallies, and run it now, and Tam swims in it, in the dark, on purpose, which his brother says is showing off and which I think is something else. Wick is 20 and has all his wind and will not stand in a chalk ring, because of Grange's rule and because he does not want one. He tells people that his spirit is a boy of 19 who cannot talk, and he thinks this is the funniest thing anybody has ever said, and he has been saying it for 6 years. She lives in the Ropewalk yard. Not in a core house and not in a tower. Dovamarsh's yard, behind the chapel where Nan Ivory's children are, with a fig tree that came up out of nothing the first summer and a wall low enough for anybody to see over. Who guards her? Nobody. The Crown tried it twice in the first year and she went and sat on the roof of the Ropewalk until they went away. People come. That is the whole of what happens there now, and it happens every day, and I sit on the wall most mornings and watch it. They come up the lane and they stand in the yard and they open their hands and they say what they want out of their own mouths, because there is no boy to say it for them anymore. They do not come alone. That is what nobody expects, and it is the half of it I go up there for. A man walks up the lane to ask for something, and whatever came out of his ring walks up it behind him, and about half of them do not go back down with him. There is a greyhound thing in that yard that belonged to a corps man who died at the row. There is a pair of small ones off the Salt Road that nobody has ever claimed, and a black and white thing in the fig tree that arrived in the second spring. Nobody feeds them and nobody has ever shifted one of them. Van Rusk came down with a book about it in the first year and sat in that lane for 2 days, and went away, and wrote a single line, and the line was that they do not take orders from her. I want that down plainly, because it is the thing the capital is most frightened of and it is the thing they have most wrong. She has never given an order in her life and she has not got a voice to give one with. A Ropewalk woman called Senet Vole came to the wall in the second year to fetch hers back. It had followed her up that lane the autumn before and had never come down again, and she stood there and called it by the name she had given it. It looked at her and it did not move. She wanted to know whether the fairy was keeping it, and I had no way to answer her, and Dovamarsh answered instead, which was that nobody in that yard has ever made one of them do anything. So Senet Vole got over the wall and picked the thing up in both hands and carried it home under her arm, and it did not fight her once. It was back in the fig tree inside a week. She comes on Sundays now and sits up there with me. They sit where she is and they watch what she does with what people bring her, which is exactly what I do, and I have never once been able to decide whether that makes me one of them. A carter named Velander came up from Saltmoor on the old road last month with his hands out and wanted to know whether she could give his daughter his ears, because the girl is 8 and hears nothing at all, and he had walked 4 days to ask. Can she keep it? That is what he wanted to know. Not until sunset. For good. She looked at him for a long time. Then she took it, and she has it, and the girl hears and the man does not, and he goes back down the Salt Road every spring to stand in the yard for an hour and does not ask for anything. A woman called Ruth Sarro came from Amel on the Harrow side who had watched her husband die at the row and wanted to give away the thing in her that woke her up at 4 in the morning. She would not take it. Is it not real? The woman wanted to know, and it was real, and I have thought about why for 2 years and my best guess is that it was not hers to give, that it belonged to the man who died, and that she has never once been fooled about what belongs to whom. A man from Westergate tried to buy. He came with money, and then he came with more money, and the third time he came he brought 6 of them and a rope, and she went up onto the ropewalk roof, and Dova Marsh came out of the yard and dealt with the whole business in under a minute with a broom and a vocabulary. The chalk house has stopped trying to write her down. Van Rusk has one line about her in 1100 entries, and the line has no rank in it. And once a season or so somebody comes up that lane who does not know, usually a young one out of the capital with an errand. They look over the wall at a green thing the size of a hunting hawk sitting in a fig tree in a widow's yard in the poor end of Bellwater, with other people's spirits sitting round her in the dirt. And they ask what she is. Dova Marsh gives them the same answer every time, in the same flat voice, because she has been waiting 6 years for each one of them. Level 1. Fairy. No result. Then they go away and they tell somebody, and it goes down the road the way things go, and about half the time it comes back to us in some other shape a month later. I am 25 years old and I have not spoken since I was 19. I run the low house with Nan Ivory, who will not stop and will not be told, and Jory comes down from the forge on Sundays and shouts at the boys about their hands. There are 400 and some children in that building at any time. They come off the roads and out of the lanes and off the Harrow side, and about a third of them arrive believing that the thing that decides what you are worth is the ring you stand in when you turn 18. That is the piece of work now. Not a ferry and not a river and not a war. The core records no level. Nobody may stand in a ring before 16. A spirit is a person's for life and cannot be taken. Those 3 rules cost Ilo Grange 4 years of shouting in the capital and cost me a voice and cost Bram O'Dell his quiet, and a child who has grown up on a road does not know any of that and does not care. What they know is that they have nothing, and that in a few years a man with chalk is going to tell them what they are. So Wick stands in front of them twice a week and tells them the story of a boy who owned a spoon, a knife, and half a blanket, and got a thing out of a chalk ring the length of his own thumb, and had a man say 2 words over it in front of a yard full of people who laughed. And then he tells them what happened after, which took 11 weeks and cost a woman her hands and an old man his quiet and a 14-year-old his wind and a man of the 4th everything he had, and gave a whole city back what a war had taken off it in one afternoon in the thaw. He tells it properly. He puts the price in first. He learned that off me, and it is the only thing I ever taught anybody that was worth teaching. I sit at the back where they can see me and I do not say anything, which they find very funny for about a week and then stop noticing. Sometimes one of them comes and finds me afterwards, usually one of the quiet ones, usually about 10 years old, and they want to know the thing that Wick cannot answer because it is not his. Was it worth it? I have no way to tell them, and I would not know what to say if I had one. What I do is take them up the lane to Dova Marsh's yard and put them on the wall next to me and let them watch the people coming up with their hands out. There is a great deal wrong with the world I helped make. She decides. One creature, in a widow's yard, with no counsel over her and no rules but her own, decides who gets to be strong and who does not, and Ilo Grange was right about that on the 9th day at Marrow Ford, and he is still right, and he says so at every opportunity. The difference is that she cannot be bought, and she cannot be ordered, and she has never once taken from a hand that was not open, and there is nobody standing in front of her doing the talking. I know how much that cost, to the person, by name, and I am the only one who knows the whole of it. Ask me whether it was worth it and I will look at you and say nothing. Take that for what it is. I am not being clever with you.
I get up early because the yard fills up early. The fig tree came out of nothing the first summer and nobody planted it, and the boys use it to get onto the wall when they think I am not looking, which I always am. Nan Ivory says I sit there too long, and she is right. 6 years and I still catch myself starting the sentence, the name and the thing and the name, before I remember that the middle of me is empty where it used to be. Then somebody down in the lane opens their hand, and something green goes across a widow's yard in the poor end of Bellwater, and I sit on a wall like everybody else and watch it happen.